Hello, I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining us today for today's conference on China and the Global South. I'm delighted to welcome you to this timely set of discussions, which our Global China Hub is proud to be hosting as part of a new joint effort with the University of Notre Dame's Pulte Institute for Global Development. This joint effort, which we're calling the China Global South Initiative, is focused on working with local partners to better understand and respond to China's strategic intentions, its methods, and its ultimate political and economic impacts in the Global South. By working together, we believe we can leverage both our organizations' capacity for generating deep insights into the domestic drivers of China's external behavior and nuanced understanding of realities on the ground across the Global South. And in doing so, we're working to address an area which remains understudied, despite the numerous ways China's role across the region will shape and is already shaping the future of the rules-based international order. This effort is critical to the work of the Atlantic Council's new Global China Hub, which we launched in September of last year, which researches and devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise. As the nexus of cross-council work on China, the Hub leverages and amplifies the efforts of our 14 other programs and centers to ascertain ground truth on China's global impact and to galvanize creative policy solutions among U.S. and allied government stakeholders. We've got a powerful set of panel sessions today covering China's political and information influence, its debt, infrastructure financing, and the future of connectivity, and building resilience to ensure that engagement with China benefits the Global South. We're also honored to be hosting Dr. Jung H Pak, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Multilateral and Global China Issues, for keynote remarks. Before we turn to David Schulman, Senior Director of the Global China Hub, to introduce Dr. Pak, I would like to invite Dr. R. Scott Appleby, Dean of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, to share with us his opening remarks. Dr. Appleby is a professor of history and a scholar of global religion who has been a member of Notre Dame's faculty since 1994. He graduated from Notre Dame in 1978 and received a master's and PhD degrees in history from the University of Chicago. From 2000 to 2014, he served as the Reagan Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Dr. Appleby is also the author or editor of 15 books and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. We at the Atlantic Council are honored to be partnering with the Pulte Institute, which is part of the Keough School, for this effort. So Dr. Appleby, over to you.
Hello, my name is Scott Appleby. I am the founding dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, which is the University of Notre Dame's new policy school. We have an office in Washington, D.C., which is the home of our Global Policy Initiative, and on campus here in South Bend, Indiana, a growing company of research scholars and teachers, including policy experts addressing a range of issues that are part of the mission of the 9 multidisciplinary units of the school. The topics that those units address include peace and conflict studies, democracy and development, civil and human rights, regional issues in East Asia, in Ireland, Europe, and Latin America, a budding concentration of studies in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have institutes dedicated to engagement with global business and policy and problem solving, with religions around the world and their work for conflict resolution, human rights, global health, and other areas. And we are focused in all of this activity around a normative proposition that the dignity of every human being should be at the centerpiece of research, scholarship, teaching, and policy analysis, and efforts to improve the world, if we can put it that way. So we are critically engaged across these 9 multidisciplinary units and in our global policy initiative with questions of self-determination, equality, conflict resolution, economic development with special attention to low-income countries of the global South. With this general background in mind, you can see why I am so pleased that the Keough School and our Pulte Institute for International Development is now in collaboration with the Atlantic Council under the able direction of our own Professor Josh Eisenman and Dr. David Schulman of the Atlantic Council. The Keough School stands ready to support this partnership vigorously, and I thank you for engaging us in the important work ahead. Best wishes for the rest of this conference.
Thank you very much to Fred and Dean Appleby for your welcoming remarks. I'm Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and I have the honor this afternoon of introducing our keynote speaker for today's conference. Dr. Jung H Pak serves as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Multilateral Affairs and Global China Issues, as well as Deputy Special Representative for North Korea. Prior to arriving at State, she held the Korea Chair and was a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Korean Peninsula issues, East Asia regional dynamics, and transnational threats. Dr. Pak has also held senior positions at the Central Intelligence Agency and served as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Korea at the National Intelligence Council. We are delighted to have the chance to hear from Dr. Pak today about her insights into the topic of today's conference and beyond. After her remarks, we'll take a quick break before coming back for the first panel session of today's conference. With that, I'd like to pass to Dr. Pak to deliver her remarks. Dr. Pak, please, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Josh, for hosting me. Really appreciate being with you all today. And before I go through the broad swath of global issues, I wanted to offer some top line points about how we're approaching PRC in the global South. As many of you have seen, the US-PRC relationship is defined by intense competition across the globe in the diplomatic, economic, tech, security, values, and information spaces. Much of this competition is occurring in the global South, and especially in the Indo-Pacific. However, our policy toward the global South is not about the PRC. It is about fostering partnerships with partners and allies in the broader region and advancing our shared interests. Our goal is not to hold the PRC or any other country back, but even as we recognize the PRC's weaknesses demographically, economically, and politically, it's important for the United States, along with our allies and partners, to push back against the challenges that Beijing poses to democratic norms and systems. Our aim is to simply defend, uphold, and revitalize that rules-based international order that we help to build and defend, which has enabled the rise of some of even our fiercest competitors. So here's a strategy for doing so. First, we are working with allies and partners on values, on trade, and on security. We've already had a series of substantive wins this year, all of which are credited to our focus on strengthening alliances, old and new. And we are committed to deepening our partnerships with countries throughout the global South. We offer a partnership that works in our interests and those of our partners, undergirded by our shared values that emphasize democratic governance, respect for human rights, entrepreneurship, transparency, inclusive economic growth, and diversity, equality, and inclusion. Second, we are putting forth an affirmative vision. We are focused on protecting and reinforcing the rules-based international system, and we are committed to promoting the shared values that support it. Third, and finally, we are investing in ourselves. You saw that with the historic investment in our infrastructure through the bipartisan infrastructure law. It also sends a powerful message abroad about our resolve and the enduring strength of our democratic system. And we know that the United States must be able to demonstrate democracy is working domestically if we expect to successfully project our values abroad. And through the President's Build Back Better World Infrastructure Partnership, we are undertaking a whole of government effort to assess how to better use our development infrastructure toolkit. And with that, let me just go through the range of global issues that we're looking at and offer some thoughts on that. First, on the Indo-Pacific Strategy. We recently rolled out President Biden's comprehensive vision for the Indo-Pacific that is free, open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. Secretary of State Blinken shared it with our partners while he was in the region, strengthening key diplomatic relationships and advancing our shared priorities. The Indo-Pacific Strategy is our affirmative strategy for the region of which we are a part. It recognizes that no region will be more vital to the United States in the future, and that American security and prosperity fundamentally depend on the Indo-Pacifics. This vision is shared in a bipartisan fashion at home, in the region, and across Europe. There are two key elements to our approach. First, this strategy aims to strengthen the United States' own role in the region. Second, it seeks to build the collective capacity to rise to 21st century challenges and seize opportunities, whether that is the behavior of the PRC, the climate crisis, or the next pandemic. The key pillars of the strategy are: one, to advance freedom and openness; two, build collective capacity within and beyond the region; three, promote shared prosperity; four, bolster Indo-Pacific security; and finally, five, build regional resilience. Heading to the Western Hemisphere. The US government believes in strengthening the Western Hemisphere as a coalition of resilient democracies that champions our shared values. We do this by working with allies and partners with a sustained commitment in virtually every dimension of our bilateral and multilateral relationships. Yet the Western Hemisphere faces long-standing challenges of economic inequality, corruption, human rights abuses, and weak democratic institutions, further exacerbated by the pandemic, that render the region more vulnerable to the PRC's aggressive and coercive practices. We do not oppose PRC engagement and investment throughout the Western Hemisphere. However, we echo the long-standing calls from Latin American capitals that PRC actions respect local laws and interests, particularly regarding the human rights of all, including workers, and protection for the environment. We highlight for partners as well specific security and data privacy risks related to PRC investments in critical infrastructure and sensitive sectors. We will support our allies and partners who speak up against adverse actions, including the use of economic coercion. Moving on to Africa. Our approach in Africa to the PRC in Africa is in partnership, again, with our allies and partners, and focuses on 5 priorities that Secretary Blinken articulated in a speech in Abuja last November. That's ending COVID-19, responding to the climate crisis, building a more stable and inclusive global economy, strengthening democracy, building a more stable and inclusive global economy, and advancing lasting peace and security. Strong US-Africa relationships enable us to address the shared challenges that we face. Our Africa policy is about Africa, not about the PRC. Many African nations welcome investment and support from a variety of partners and dislike being asked to choose sides in a perceived US-PRC rivalry. We don't want to make African nations choose. We want to give African nations choices. Nevertheless, there is broad acknowledgement that the PRC wields significant influence in Africa as its largest trading partner, foreign investor, and bilateral creditor. Part of ensuring that African governments and publics have options is ensuring that US companies can compete on an even playing field. We will draw attention to corrupt or coercive practices that damages our interests and those of our African partners, and instead promote market, trade, and commercial practices that do not threaten our partners' national security or data privacy. In doing so, the United States promotes democratic governance, respect for human rights, and transparency. Our focus in Africa is on strengthening local capacity, creating African and American jobs, and working with our partners to promote economic benefits and growth that is beneficial and sustainable and inclusive over the long term. On to South and Central Asia. We're committed to robust engagement with these countries throughout the South and Central Asian region to support their sovereignty and independence in the face of transnational repression, disinformation, and corrupt commercial deals. The United States remains a reliable international partner to the governments and to the people of these countries and continues to stand up for human rights and democracy. India is one of our most important partners in the Indo-Pacific region. The US welcomes India's emergence as a leading global power and its role as a net security provider in the region. Additionally, the Quad, of which India is a member, is an essential multilateral mechanism that convenes 4 like-minded democracies to coordinate in the Indo-Pacific, confirming our collective commitment to ensuring peace, security, and prosperity in the region. We will continue to work with our partners and allies to promote accountability for the PRC government's use of forced labor, as well as its genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang. Along those lines, we will also continue to press Beijing to cease ongoing abuses against Tibetans and return to direct dialogue with the Dalai Lama or his Tibetan representatives without preconditions to resolve differences. The US supports meaningful autonomy for Tibetans. Within Central Asia, our engagement increases these states' ability to resist bilaterally and collectively the problematic behavior and actions of Russia and the PRC. We also work with each of the Central Asian governments to advance their rule of law reform, improve human rights standards, advance gender equality, improve English language and basic education, and to counter the negative impacts of the PRC's questionable loan practices, as well as Russian disinformation. The US Central Asia strategy reiterates our commitment to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the 5 Central Asian countries. Finally, let me end with the Middle East. I'd like to begin with the broadest, but perhaps the most important point. The president has articulated a clear strategic vision, committing us to a more sustainable set of long-term relationships with our partners in the Middle East. These relationships feature an affirmative agenda, one that focuses on solving shared problems and building shared prosperity by revitalizing the institutions and alliances of the international order that provide regional and global stability. In the Middle East, we are prioritizing diplomatic, economic, and development tools to strengthen partnerships. And we have a strong foundation. From the $137 billion in trade between Middle Eastern countries and the United States in 2019, the robust people-to-people ties, the doubling of private sector investment in the past decade, just to name a few. On security, we support multilateral diplomacy with partners and allies to advance UN-facilitated peace processes in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. And we're committed to ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon, and we continue to believe the JCPOA is the best way to address Iran's nuclear program. We are, of course, paying close attention to the PRC's involvement in the Middle East and North Africa. The PRC seeks to deepen engagement, often in ways that are at odds with our shared interests and desire for stability in the region. We know that our allies and partners have complex relationships with the PRC, and we encourage countries of the region to be in the driver's seat of those relationships as we do in the Middle East and North Africa as elsewhere. They should guard against allowing Beijing's influence and activities to undermine the region's prosperity, stability, and long-standing relationships with its global partners, including the United States. And with that very broad sweep trip across the globe on PRC in the Global South, as well as the U.S. Approach to those regions, thank you for your time and attention and affording me this opportunity to speak with you today.
Welcome back, and thank you again to Deputy Assistant Secretary Jung Pak for her insightful keynote remarks. We're excited to kick off 3 panels now this afternoon with an array of experts who cover China's relations and influence in the Global South from a wide variety of angles. Our first panel today covers a particularly challenging question for understanding China's engagement in the Global South, namely, how can we best map and understand China's growing political and information influence across the numerous regions and countries that make up this vast part of the world? A significant amount of attention has been paid to measuring and analyzing China's mounting economic influence, which is of course critical, and we'll address that issue in the second panel. But much less attention has been paid to the political and information domains because, in part, they're much less easy to quantify. Fortunately, we have with us today an outstanding group of experts who are leaders in developing innovative ways to measure and analyze China's influence and impact in these areas, and I'd like to introduce them now. We have Dr. Joseph Asunka, CEO of Afrobarometer, a Pan-African independent nonpartisan research network that measures public attitudes on economic, political, and social matters in Africa. Next, we have Samantha Custer, Director of Policy Analysis at AidData. Ms. Custer's policy analysis unit blends qualitative and quantitative approaches to answer real-world questions in a way that's both academically rigorous and policy relevant. We are also delighted to have Parsifal De Sola, a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and the founder and CEO of the Andres Bello Foundation China Latin America Research Center in Bogota. Parsifal is a Chinese foreign policy analyst specializing in Sino-Latin American relations with a focus on Venezuela. And finally, we have Christopher Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. Chris oversees the department that's responsible for the NED's multifaceted analytical work, which includes the International Forum for Democratic Studies, a leading center for the analysis and discussion of democratic development. Thank you all for joining us today. So to get things started, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to share some initial comments about the topic of today's discussion. And we will start with Dr. Asunka. Dr. Asunka, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, David, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to share a few thoughts in terms of what the Afrobarometer has done and continues to do when it comes to China and Africa. Of course, we cover several topics, but China and Africa is always one of our major topics because our main theme is democracy and governance. And when you talk of China's influence, those two variables come into play so much. So just my general few remarks is, first of all, mapping and trying to figure out China's influence across the Global South in particular, and Africa, where I know best, is, there are a couple of things. One, just academic curiosity. People really want to understand how the influence looks like. And so just really documenting, understanding how China plays a role in the political and information spaces is important for just, even if it is just purely academic exercise. Of course, there's the issue of thinking about whether or not these influences are negative or positive or neutral in some ways, and just getting to understand what the influence is and being able to quantify its impact on people's lives in particular, because for the Afrobarometer, that's what we care about. Like, how do interventions by global powers like China influence people's lives? And I think that is the core thing. And the third part is just thinking about, and I think that in many ways, how China interacts with other superpowers, global powers, whether it is economic or political powers, I think is important for us to tease those things out and understand where in that kind of interaction, are those interactions complementary, or are they really causing more harm to the people that they hope to serve? And I think understanding those dynamics can allow us to address those.
Great, thank you, Joseph. Next, I'd like to turn to Ms. Custer.
Sure, thanks so much, David, and to the rest of the panelists for being here. I think a good place to start is, to set the stage for what we're talking about. So we can all think of discrete examples of Beijing's bid for influence in the Global South that are readily visible to us, right? From a local Confucius Institute to a state-backed infrastructure project to a Chinese diplomat using Twitter to promote pro-China narratives. But the challenge is that despite these visible signs, we have fairly minimal details on the specifics. Which countries or communities are receiving more of Beijing's attention and why? And how well is Beijing actually able to translate potential or economic soft power into realized influence with foreign leaders and publics? And so in the absence of hard evidence, then it becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction or myth from fact to answer a fairly fundamental question. Who is Beijing seeking to influence, how, and to what effect? And I thought to set the stage for today's discussion, I'd share 3 key insights from a multi-year effort that we've undertaken to quantify Beijing's influence playbook with 40 Asia-Pacific countries over 2 decades. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is that at a time when advanced economies are turning inward, Beijing has consistently doubled down on its economic and soft power overtures over a 2-decade period. For example, in the economic arena, over the last 18 years, the Chinese government bankrolled more than $174 billion in financial diplomacy across the Asia Pacific. Most of this financing was issued as debt, using loans approaching market rates, and oriented towards infrastructure investments. But Beijing also made substantial soft power investments to foster people-to-people ties across the region. In the Asia Pacific region alone, Beijing bankrolled nearly 17,000 scholarships for study abroad opportunities. It established over 1,000 sister city agreements that twin Chinese cities and provinces with counterparts in other countries. It brokered nearly 100 partnerships between Chinese state-owned media and local media in counterpart countries to reprint, share, or co-create media content. It opened over 300 Confucius Institutes in classrooms to promote Chinese language and culture, and many more examples. But the second important takeaway from this work is that Beijing does not employ a one-size-fits-all influence strategy. Chinese leaders have focused their efforts to build deep but narrow corridors of power with a small subset of strategically important communities. We found that Beijing directs most of its influence overtures towards countries that meet one or more of the following criteria. They represent attractive market opportunities for Chinese goods or capital. They have large natural resource endowments, and/or they may have rich stocks of potential energy supplies. And in terms of the distribution of some of these overtures, wealthier countries are receiving more of Beijing's soft power tools, while energy-rich countries are attracting more of Beijing's state-backed financing. But even this picture obscures another fact, which is that Beijing places greater strategic importance on some communities within those countries than others. Here's a telling case in point. We found that 3 provinces received more money from Beijing than 7 of the 13 countries in South and Central Asia over a 2-decade period. Just 16 cities in the same subregion attracted over half of Beijing's city-level diplomacy overtures, everything from language and cultural promotion to sister cities and content-sharing partnerships. And so the question becomes, what makes these communities so attractive to Beijing? It's the more populous districts and those with natural gas pipelines that received more of Beijing's financial diplomacy dollars. And those top 16 magnets for Beijing's soft power overtures were primarily politically important national capitals or large metropolitan areas that were economically attractive markets for Beijing. And the final takeaway I thought I'd share is that when we examine the returns to Beijing influence efforts over time, we do see some evidence of pro-China narratives taking hold in the global South, but also indications of some mixed results. We found that Beijing is largely successful in promoting the narrative that future prosperity requires closer economic and social integration with China. We found that public, private, and civil society leaders most frequently cited China's economic importance to explain Beijing's favorability and influence in their countries on 2 different surveys we did in 2020 and 2021. But leaders aren't alone in this view. Citizens increasingly look to China for access to jobs, financial capital, export markets, professional networks. And we found that Beijing's highly publicized economic investments generate greater interest among local populations to learn Chinese language and to study in China. In parallel, Beijing's soft power overtures create future markets for Chinese goods, services, and technology. Countries in the global South have also taken on board the narrative that the political costs outweigh the economic benefits of criticizing Beijing's actions. We've seen that leaders are unwilling to publicly criticize Beijing on sensitive issues for fear of how this would affect their country's prospects for aid, trade, and investment. And this unwillingness to criticize Beijing appears to extend to local media outlets. The sentiment or tone of media coverage about China and the Asia-Pacific region has become more neutral over the last decade compared to greater volatility previously. But equally important is what is not being said. Notably, while there's an uptick in human rights stories published by Asian news outlets over the last 2 decades, there has not been a corresponding increase in China-specific human rights stories. Finally, we're seeing an indication that countries in the global south have demonstrated growing appreciation of, or at least acceptance of, Beijing's development model. Tellingly, leaders from 141 low and middle income countries identified Beijing as highly influential in shaping their domestic policy priorities in 2020. China was among the top 10 most influential development partners globally, and this dynamic was even more pronounced in the Asia-Pacific. But at the same time, Beijing's economic and soft power overtures have produced mixed results. Leaders surveyed viewed Beijing as highly influential, but expressed concern that this influence might be a net negative for their countries. There are some examples of Beijing's exchange, cultural promotion, and partnerships with local media that have been associated with more favorable citizen views of China. But there's also examples of Beijing's economic investments and leader visits that have been associated with lower levels of approval. So I think all of this underscores how converting power into influence with foreign publics and leaders is easier said than done, and why this conversation is so important. I'll leave it there, David.
Great, Samantha. Thank you very much. That leaves us a lot to dig into in the conversation. Parsifal, over to you next.
Thank you, David. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you and the team at the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council for putting this event together and for the invitation. I will get right to the subject matter. So, measuring Chinese influence in the global south. That is a very broad, open-ended topic. Among the circle of Latin American professionals that work on topics related to China, and I am sure this has also happened to my fellow panelists here today, a lot of us have been asked by journalists, media outlets, and politicians, what does China want in Latin America or Africa or the Middle East or somewhere else? These kinds of overarching questions are all basically non-starters. They serve no purpose, and most importantly, they truly have no answer. Who or what is China? What are we referring to? The CCP, the state, the government, the military? Are we referring to SOEs, private companies, Chinese diaspora? Another problem with these kinds of questions is that they generally portray the countries that are subject to Chinese influence as passive receptors with no agency or decision-making power in front of China's growing clout, be it economic, political, or social. I would like to briefly describe what we've been working on at our organization in order to drive my point home. For the past year or so, we've been building a database on Sino-Venezuelan joint funds. This project seeks to document all there is to know about the funds that were created between China and Venezuela between 2005 and 2017 and organize the information in a searchable database. This will include all sorts of data, explanations on the working of the funds, their legal implications, companies involved, Chinese, Venezuelan joint ventures, the projects that derived from these funds, their current state, whether they were finished or halfway or were even started, corruption cases, destination of the funds, among other data. Aside from collecting and organizing all this information and making it accessible to the public, what we hope to build is a solid data-driven case study of the detrimental implications of unregulated and untransparent backdoor financing practices, be them from China or anywhere else. While we are still in the middle of the project, I can still share with you some of the preliminary findings we've made so far. So one aspect that has caught our attention is that the arrangements from the Venezuelan side began years before the first fund agreement was signed in 2007, which is one of the reasons why we cannot detach Venezuela's domestic context from the country's democratic backsliding from the analysis. Back in 2005, Venezuela's legislature, the first body of government co-opted by the executive branch, back when Venezuela still had independent branches of government, it was in complete control by the United Social Chavez. This was key for what would become Venezuela's largest ever foreign debt undertaking and China's largest financial exposure in the world. So when you analyze some of these contracts signed between both governments, you find wording and non-disclosure clauses that in all but name bar the executive from sharing information with other branches of government, not to mention the public. If this sounds unconstitutional, it's because it is, or at least it used to be, under Venezuela's legislature before it was taken over by Chavez loyalists. These contracts were very well thought out. They legally shield the financial credit lines from any kind of oversight, including both from the corresponding Venezuelan authorities in charge of financial oversight, as well as public scrutiny. To date, these contracts are in practice property of the executive branch of the Venezuelan government controlled by Maduro and cannot be disclosed. There is no doubt that Venezuelan authorities received counsel from PRC counterparts on the drafting of these documents. And what is more, given the high-level engagement between both countries at the time, plus the changes to Venezuela's legal code, which allowed for the legalization of these agreements, changes that took years, I should mention, it's safe to say that the process of bulletproofing these agreements from any sort of oversight, official or otherwise, began long before the first joint fund came into being. So you can draw two conclusions from this. First, Chinese authorities and representatives did not coerce Venezuelan institutions into signing these agreements. The Venezuelan government exercised complete agency in the negotiations. These people knew what they were doing, they planned for it, they received counseling on it, and they thoroughly executed. This clearly exemplifies that the so-called debt trap narrative is completely unsubstantiated. That in a way, it was truly a win-win scenario. The Chinese government received an unwavering promoter of its interest in Latin America and the Caribbean, and those in power in Venezuela received a direct, unregulated financial line from outside Western institutions. And two, Venezuelan government institutions and personnel involved in negotiating and drafting the agreements received key know-how from Chinese counterparts, know-how that can be translated as illiberal practices that significantly contributed to Venezuela's democratic backslide. So based on our experiences, focusing on intent, on purposeful foreign policy will only get you so far. So why did China pour itself into Venezuela? Was it oil, to gain a foothold in traditional US area of influence, to balance US power in the region? And the usual answer is all of the above, or it's complicated. So focusing on intent has little empirical and practical value. In Venezuela's case, when you narrow down the scope and focus on observable phenomena, in this case, the compounding effects of unregulated financial flows coming from China and the unbound corruption surrounding the funds, then you can make a solid case about the negative aspects of Chinese engagement with the country. If you take a look at the China Select Forum or the China LATAM white papers, these papers are public official letters of intent. They make headlines for sure, but they do not necessarily translate into action. And as you probably are all aware of, the Chinese government loves grand rhetoric and pompous headlines. So to wrap up, from a methodological point of view, it makes more sense and has a higher probability of proving useful to politicians and policymakers, whether they are sitting in DC, in Bogota, in Lima, in Buenos Aires, or any other capital around the world, to focus on the consequences and the effects, to focus on data, which I might add there's a huge lack of. And most importantly, since the data has to be interpreted, the need to interpret the data through the prism of a domestic framework. So in Latin America's case, corruption, environmental degradation, rule of law, these are some of the main topics that interest politicians in the region. These are the talking points that win elections and matter to the public. Unfortunately, topics on human rights, about Hong Kong, Uyghurs, these are basically non-issues for governments and the public in the region, as well as 5G, data privacy, among other points. I will leave it at that and hope to continue talking about these points throughout the hour.
Great, thank you, Percival. I think, that's a lot to dig into, and I think, we definitely want to focus, we should be focusing on the data, on measuring the types of, engagements and the impact that they have. And then, of course, as you say, not just focusing on the China side, but looking at, what's happening in terms of recipient governments and their role in those engagements, and certainly not putting culpability for any negatives that come from those engagements on one side. There's plenty of blame to go around. So we can maybe dig into that more in the conversation. But now I want to turn over to Chris Walker for his comments.
So thanks so much to you, Dave, and to the organizers for the opportunity to join you in this discussion. I'm going to touch on 3 points. The first is control as an abiding need of authoritarian powers. The second point is non-transparency as an essential feature of authoritarian governance. And then the third is a failure of imagination in open societies about what makes authoritarian powers tick. So let me start with the first element of this, which is control. We're speaking on a day today when Russia's leadership has chosen to take extreme measures in an attempt to assert control over Ukraine, peaceful neighbor that poses no threat to Russia. There are significant differences between Russia and China for certain, but I would contend that at root, the leadership that dominates both of those countries operate control regimes. That's what their overarching aim is. In China's case, the Chinese Communist Party, which is the paramount political power in the country, controls and at least seeks to control information and media, politics, education, history, technology. The authorities in China repress the Tibetans. They're undertaking unspeakable crimes against the Uyghurs. They've subjugated Hong Kong and they're threatening Taiwan. Control is in the DNA of the CCP. I think as we see in more advanced democracies, even powerful institutions like the National Basketball Association, other sports enterprises, major educational institutions, North America and Europe, struggle to manage the engagement they have with the Chinese authorities and their proxies, whether it's in the commercial domain or otherwise. And I think this is something we need to keep in mind as we think about countries in the global south. If major institutions that are well-resourced in advanced settings have their own problems, this is probably a similar challenge elsewhere. Second point I'm going to touch on is non-transparency. And a critical feature of China's engagement beyond its borders is opacity. And Parsival touched on this a bit. I think it's important to recognize that projects developed and deals that are agreed to as part of the process by which China and its proxies engage abroad are often done with elites, often with executive branch elites, They tend to avoid the legislatures, not just in settings like Venezuela, which has undergone a profound constriction of political space since Hugo Chavez was in power and since Maduro has driven that country into the political ground. This is true in all sorts of settings in which there's far more political space and media space, where we see this methodology of trying to limit the exposure and discussion of a wide range of deals, whether these are investment deals, media content sharing agreements in countries as diverse as Egypt, Italy, any number of countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, others in Latin America. The common thread is that these deals are learned about after the fact. And that's not healthy for democratic governance. It's not healthy for human rights and freedom of expression standards. And it's something that many countries are grappling with. I think some of the concrete examples we might look to in this case, and there are many more than these, are the ECU 9/11 case in Ecuador, which was a technology case, ostensibly a safety and security tech program that was repurposed in other ways. Serbia is grappling in a profound way with a deep diffusion of Chinese technology. That country has not had a meaningful public debate about the adoption of these incredibly important and powerful technologies. And then in Africa, the BRI and Chinese securities firms tracking throughout the region also has not had meaningful public debate, as I understand it. So in all these cases, the common thread is a lack of transparency and deep opacity. So I would just stress the point that pluralism and openness are anathema to the CCP and their proxies, certainly at home. And I think we have to at least interrogate how that plays out when the CCP and its proxies engage overseas. Finally, I would touch on this idea of a failure of imagination in open societies. There's almost an irresistible urge to try to understand China and the CCP-led system as if it were an open society. And we use frameworks and concepts that we typically apply in open societies to the case of China. But China is not an open society. It does not embrace pluralism and openness and open competition as that's understood in open societies. And the fact it's not has implications both for those living within the PRC, as I mentioned, but also beyond its borders. And I think this is something that we're still coming to terms with. This impulse, I suspect, is in part due to widespread political illiteracy about China, its foreign policy, the CCP, the United Front Work Department. There are massive gaps in literacy everywhere, whether we're talking about North America, Europe. It's certainly true in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. It's true in big parts of Europe as well. And it's something we need to come to grips with, because ultimately, if we're going to understand and be able to measure the impacts, and I would strongly endorse what Parsival said, it's not so much about the tools and resources that are being applied, which are admittedly massive in the ways that Samantha Custer went through. It's actually the effects of these and what they're inducing and what they're bringing about in democratic governance terms, whether it's suppressing expression on university campuses, co-opting political elites, or repurposing institutions, including, for example, the WHO, which is something we might get into as part of this discussion. And so I think part of the answer to this challenge, and we're making a little bit of headway, but it's not fast enough or comprehensive enough, is to ensure that there's locally based expertise that understands not China as a development model, but at China as a political actor. And that, I think, is what is profoundly lacking in so many of the places we're talking about. And then one last point, I'm always a little bit reluctant to separate the North and the South and divide, because I think we're all struggling with how to deal with the China challenge. And the fact is, we can learn from each other and find ways to accelerate our learning to safeguard democratic governance and human rights standards. But if we use these division equations in this, I actually think that plays into the hands of the Chinese authorities, who are masterful at dividing open societies, both among themselves, but I think between different subsets of them. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, a lot of additional important points on the sharp power methods, but also just on the importance of understanding China and the Chinese Communist Party's political system, and also well taken points on the trying to divide out the North and the South, which can often create some kind of superficial or fake divides when we're all facing some similar questions. Before I dive into questions, I'd like to quickly remind our audience on YouTube to submit your questions in the side chat, on Facebook to submit via comments, and on Twitter to submit using the hashtag AC Global China. So I think the panelists' comments certainly underscored the complexity and importance of mapping China's influence in the political and information space, and really underscored each of you the importance of really digging into the impact that China's influence in these areas is having, and not just on the intentions or the tools that are involved. And because you've all been working in this space for quite a long time, I want to kind of trying to draw out any more thoughts you might have on where should more energy and resources be placed? Where do we really need more data and better analysis to help local governments, help civil society and private enterprise in countries across the global South to better understand and address these issues and deal with whatever negative impacts might be coming from China's political and information influence? So I'd open that up to anyone on the panel who might want to kick us off.
So I'm happy maybe to build on the last point I made, Dave, just briefly. I think I'll use the media and information domain as the example here. I think right now, because the independent media just about everywhere is under duress and public trust media is so stressed, China's investments, I should say that the Chinese authorities' investments in this domain is terribly important because it can shape discussions in ways that are favorable to the narrow interests of the authorities in Beijing. It's so important to emphasize when we talk about China, there's very little civil society independent input into the public discussion of China. This is controlled, or at least there's a massive effort to seek to control the public debate by the authorities in China. And so when we talk about content sharing agreements, these are content sharing agreements, whether it's between Italy's RAI, the public broadcaster, and Chinese state media, or any other country, democracy and China, it's invariably with Chinese state media. And I think having both weak analytical capacity in so many countries to understand China's media system, but also to have the media capacity to talk both about the human rights abuses, the Chinese political system, so that people in, say, Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa have a better understanding of China and don't see it through rose-colored glasses that might be portrayed through certain media sources, I think is a terribly important point. But it comes back to these critically important investments in local capacity, whether it's analytical, whether it's independent media, and that's sorely lacking in so many settings.
Maybe I'll just come in here briefly to talk just on the issue of, when you think about the impacts of what China does on on people's lives, as I mentioned at the beginning, it comes down to, it's not just the media and how the media is portrayed or the ways that China controls the media in the global north. I do think a lot of first points about there's agency on the various parts. In Africa, people have agency in terms of what they take and how they interact with Chinese operatives, whether it's Chinese government or civil society actors or even Chinese citizens. And so when it comes to what is the impact of what China does on people's lives, it's not just a matter of how much they control the media in terms of how the narrative is shaped by the media, but how do people feel and how do people express themselves? And how do we mobilize in a way that we can get directly citizen voice in terms of how they feel, how they experience China in their day-to-day lives? And I think in some ways, if you're thinking about China's impact, say, on governance and democracy, that's one level. China's impact on people's lives is another level. We can think of ways to measure the quality of governance or the behavior of leaders in different countries to see to what extent is China's investments or any other engagements on the different parts of the global south impacting how democracy or the quality of governance is progressing. And that is one end where there can be some analytics to try to get at that. If you really want to understand how does this impact people, and it could happen in different ways. It could just be that the Chinese investments is really improving people's lives. And so if you're thinking of interventions that could counter or undermine Chinese investment, then you are already going counter to what people are actually experiencing on the ground. So as we think about ways to figure out how Chinese investments is probably affecting institutions and how local actors actually interact with Chinese to further either damage political institutions, we also need to take it from the people's experiences. And for us at the Afrobarometer, this is one of the areas where we try to measure the influence of global powers on the continent. We go to the people, we ask them about Chinese investments, and it's not that they are not visible. They see the Chinese, especially when it comes to, somebody mentioned about BRI, or any infrastructure project on the African continent. It is visible to people, and they know how it affects their lives. And so in some ways, complementing whatever measures we may have in terms of the real hard data on infrastructure and China's influence on the quality of democratic institutions, which is what we also measure, we also need to look at it from the citizen perspective. And the data that we have does show, you would see clearly that people see China's influence in a very different light. And so it's really good to try to understand that as we think about ways that we can measure China's influence.
Yeah, Joseph, I've always thought the Afrobarometer's polling and results on African views of China's political economic influence and how it's been, at least my reading of it, fairly positive, right? And then kind of comparing that with some responses on democracy and preferred models to follow, and looking at the different types of results you get with those kinds of polling is very interesting. And so maybe we can talk more in a second. Just I think using that kind of public polling data to tailor objectives to really to right size what our expectations for realities on the ground and how people are perceiving China is really important. Parsifal, go ahead.
Thanks. I couldn't agree more with both points with what Christopher and Joseph just mentioned. On the topic of media, for sure, there is a lot to unpack. Just to give a personal anecdote, a couple of weeks ago, I found out that CGTN had approached Grupo Caracol in Colombia. Grupo Caracol is the most important media conglomerate in Colombia. They were interested in signing a content sharing agreement. And as Christopher mentioned, these are, it's a policy that it's being implemented throughout the global south, and it's very poorly documented. And that is extremely important for several reasons. One of them, at least in Latin America, most countries have 2-3 of the tops media conglomerates. So if you signed a content agreement with the head office, that will trickle down to the smaller media that actually depend on the head office. These kinds of agreements have been done between media outlets for decades now, but obviously signing one with CGTN or Tsinghua will have an important impact on the type of consumes, not.
First of all, we seem to be having some trouble with your connection. Maybe turn off your video, try that.
That is actually a little bit better. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that might be better. Go ahead.
Okay, so as I was saying, this is kind of a thin veil that obscures the original source of the information. And if you sign these agreements, the topics on China will definitely get affected, and we will not see a larger coverage of topics as regarded to human rights and oppressive policies coming from Beijing. So I think there's a lot to unpack and to do further research on. And on what Joseph was mentioning, in the terms of the impact, there is in Latin America, there's nothing, not even close or compared to the work that Joseph does in terms of, polling and collecting data on how the region perceives China in different sectors, be it technology, political wise, great power competition, et cetera, et cetera. So no, definitely, I think those are two important areas where further resources and research is needed.
Yeah, Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on what others have said. So I think if there's a need for additional understanding on both the inputs and the outcome side. On the input side, it is far easier for us to monitor when it is China that is the face of an influence operation or an influence activity, as opposed to China's ability to cultivate sympathetic interlocutors. That's why I think that the content sharing partnerships or the journalist exchanges or things like this that effectively mean that China doesn't have to rely on its own propaganda apparatus to do things directly. It can do it indirectly through these other actors is so powerful, but it's so difficult to track. And that is the key. I think secondly, I was shocked, frankly, when I did the most recent piece of research trying to look at who were the priority communities that China was focusing on within countries. And I had not anticipated the high degree of concentration of where it's focusing its efforts and resources. And yet seldom do we think about this either from the US government responding or, when analysts or policymakers are thinking about influence in these communities. We treat countries with broad brushes and say, oh, what's happening in Uganda or Ukraine, or rather than really having a subnational kind of a deeper understanding of, which countries or which communities are most critical. I think that there is an importance of being able to disentangle the tools that China is using for show versus the tools that it's using for effect. And what I mean by that is I did a little bit of looking at China's presence on Twitter and its ability to reach elite audiences within South and Central Asia, given how much wolf warrior diplomacy has been in the news. And what was fascinating is when you actually look at target audiences of elites within these countries, very few of them are following or are followed by Chinese government-affiliated accounts. And what that means is that China in practice is relying on a relatively small number of brokers to be able to reach these audiences. And it makes you wonder if most of this posturing is actually for the US's benefit as opposed to trying to reach target audiences in other countries. On the outcome side, I think that there's a need to disentangle quantifying policy changes. I think when you are trying to look at this from a measurement perspective over time and space, you have to look at proxies. And so for me, sometimes that's been trying to ask people about who's influencing their policy priorities. But I think what's really interesting is when you can follow that thread all the way to changes in actual policy or legislation. And that is difficult to quantify. And then finally, I'll say, a comparative view. So Joseph talked about the importance of monitoring citizen perceptions. I do a lot on leader perceptions. We're both interested in looking at how China is perceived, but often what is also revealing is how this is viewed in relation to other countries. And more often than not, there's actually a fair amount of country perceptions of foreign powers tracking together, that if you're seeing improvements in how China is perceived, in the absence of understanding how other foreign powers are perceived, you could jump to wrong conclusions.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. And I wanted to follow up with you because you and others who have also looked at this, but you in particular have looked at taken an integrated view of influence, looking at what's happening in the information space and the political space, as well as how that interacts with what's happening in the economic space in terms of China's engagement And as you said, earlier, it's really important to kind of bring these things together. So I want to kind of get a sense from you as to, what these intersections tell you about China's approach to influence in different places, given, the level of economic relationship that China might have in a place, or the receptivity to engagement with China that, a local environment might have, or whether you see, for instance, changes if there's a change in regime or government in a place where China has significant interest that might be put at risk. Do you see more of a emphasis on information influence and so forth?
Yeah, I think I can speak to that generally and then talk about a specific example that comes to mind. So I think that China's greatest success, in exerting influence has been in its ability to exploit the synchronicity or the interplay of the economic and the soft power tools, or the economic and the information tools. I've interviewed hundreds of leaders in the Asia-Pacific region, and we've done surveys, and, it is very rare that somebody would say, I am intrinsically motivated to learn Chinese language or learn, Chinese culture or go study abroad just because I am attracted to these things. But invariably it comes back to, well, this is tied to my economic livelihood. This is tied to economic prosperity. That's true whether you look at it from the perspective of a government leader who says, hey, if infrastructure is the gateway to growth, then China is the only game in town. Or, if you're looking at this from the perspective of a citizen who's saying, hey, Chinese companies are descending upon my country. I have an opportunity to go work for them if I, study in the right place and speak the right language. So there's definitely an economic cornerstone to China's influence. But I think that we can't undercut or underemphasize the importance of people-to-people ties. I think that as China is facilitating these exchanges, that is influencing professional norms. When you are training local police in law enforcement practices, when you're training government officials in thinking about justice reforms, these things are going to, have broader influence even beyond the economics. But I do think that, what makes leaders and citizens pay attention to China is the economics. And I think it's the soft power, the people-to-people ties that allows that economic influence to diffuse within other facets of society. I think that is how I would see it. I think the COVID-19 example is an interesting case study for how China has been exploiting the interplay of these tools. And what's striking about that, if you think about it, a couple of years back, China began on the defensive at the start of the pandemic, facing a lot of criticism for how it was handling the outbreak within its own country and the lack of transparency. You fast forward a few years later, we did a survey just last year asking leaders which foreign power they thought best adapted its public diplomacy in the time of COVID. And they said China, far and beyond above Russia or India or the US. And it's an interesting example where China leveraged the economics of large-scale donations of vaccines and medical equipment and supplies, with sending people, medical teams, and support staff, with an effective use of a fairly large information apparatus in terms of being able to showcase the beneficence of what China was doing, but then also demonstrate the relative ineffectiveness of some of the other competitors' responses. And then also really playing up the fact that it was leading the charge on regional cooperation efforts on pandemic response and resilience. So I think that you could have seen some influence from any one of those tools, but I think it's the force multiplier effect of all of these things kind of working together that really allowed it to get the kind of traction it did.
Yeah, I think those are very important points. And I want to bring in the rest of our panelists specifically on that COVID-19 point. I know that Parsifal, you've done some work on China's approach to COVID-19 vaccines and what it's meant to kind of perceptions in Latin America versus the U.S. and others. Joseph, I know there's been a lot in Africa, a lot of kind of following perceptions and pushback and views of what China was doing in terms of PPE and then vaccines and then issues around debt related to the aftermath or the effects of the pandemic. And Chris, you've certainly looked at these issues as well. So just curious if others want to jump in on that.
Should I go?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me know if there's a problem with the connection. No, I think what Samantha is saying, it's right on point. From what we've seen, at least at higher politics, the response from Latin American governments to these so-called vaccine diplomacy, which I should add, very little donations, around, at least comparatively speaking, to the United States. China has donated around 4 million, give or take 1 or 2 million vaccines to Latin American countries, as compared to the United States, which has donated over 40 million. That being said, from a public diplomacy point of view, too little, too late. The push from the Chinese side had already left its mark. It was first with PPE. It didn't. You didn't see any discussions or around whether people were getting the vaccines or not getting the vaccines, or people hesitant about getting vaccines. And I think all of that was very well used by China's diplomats in Latin America. I'm referring to ambassadors, consuls, and other political attaches. Where you saw them at the airports, and all these grand gestures were covered by local media. So you reached a lot of people. And then you saw, President Piñera from Chile being vaccinated with Sinovac on national television, and the same with the governor of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So they really did a tremendous job in leveraging their whole diplomatic corps and the whole selling of vaccines. And I think it's going to have a lasting effect on how China is perceived in Latin America.
Thanks. Chris, go ahead.
So I think it speaks to how much of a premium the authorities in China put on information. And they really do it in a way that is quite impressive. I don't think in necessarily positive ways, but I think it's impressive. And it's something that the democracies aren't very good at, including the US these days on these kinds of things. And I would also commend everyone to research that Peter Kreco has done in the Journal of Democracy in an article titled How Autocrats Inflate Their Image, where in countries in Europe, even when the European Union provided far more support materially and substantively, public opinion polling shows that citizens there see China being a far more forward-leaning supporter on these things, even when it wasn't donated, when it was offered commercially, and so forth and so on. So I think it's something for us to reflect on this issue of how China affects people's lives and what it means in governance terms. I'll just make this point. I think we really need to think hard about China's training, say, of police forces, security services, judges in a country that has no rule of law and that is run on the basis of basically a dictatorship. And so when training is being provided to judges, policemen, in open societies, irrespective of where it is, that's something we need to reflect very hard on, because we shouldn't assume that a priori, because there's training, even in exchanges, educational exchanges, where, for example, when there are exchanges to the PRC, as I understand it, it's basically a one-party line sort of training. It's not like the sort of exchange you would get if you had a European Union exchange taking you to Brussels. It's different. And that has to be interrogated pretty seriously, because in democratic governance terms, I suspect we may not be scrutinizing this in quite the right ways in terms of effects, not in terms of the resources, the inputs, but the effects on the participants in these sorts of things.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we're just almost out of time, but Joseph, I want to give you the last word if there's anything you wanted to add on this topic.
Right. Just briefly on COVID-19, yes, I think in many ways, as Samantha mentioned, is the soft power that makes the greatest impact. And of course, China has an interest because it's not just a matter of investing in Africa, but it creates jobs for its own citizens. And if you have a big population and you can find a way to decongest how many of them are looking for jobs internally, I think it's just a huge way to go, because that's how China is out to relieve itself of the economic pressures that comes from its own citizens. And so if you look across Africa, all the investments, lots of it is implemented by Chinese workers. And that's just certainly an economic interest for China. And of course, China is interested in Africa's natural resources, which is a big area for them in terms of making sure that at least they also do have the economic resources in the future to meet their own population growth, but also creating opportunities for their citizens elsewhere. I think when it came to COVID-19, of course, just making the public PR in terms of how much China is being forthcoming in supporting poor countries with the COVID vaccine, I think that was a strategic move. It was more a political strategy than it is an economic program. And I think, they beat the West to it in many ways because they have become, in the eyes of many African citizens, the ones that carried out vaccine diplomacy much better than anybody else.
Great, thank you, Joseph. Well, we are unfortunately out of time today for this first panel session. I'd like to close by thanking our distinguished panelists for joining us today. I think we covered a lot of territory, but it's a very complex subject, so we could hopefully have a whole nother session and invite you all back another time soon. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back for our second panel discussion of today's conference at 3:20 Eastern Time. So stay tuned, and thanks again.
Welcome back. Welcome back to those of you who joined us for the first panel. I'm Joshua Eisenman, Associate Professor of Politics at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm excited to be moderating this second panel on debt, infrastructure financing, and the future of connectivity in the Global South. We have four fantastic panelists joining us today, so I'd like to get started by introducing them. The first is going to be Yunnan Chen, a Senior Research Officer at ODI. Yunnan is a specialist on China's overseas development finance, whose research focuses on development finance institutions and infrastructure finance in Africa. Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Iman Farhai, a research specialist in Chinese affairs from Egypt. Iman has more than a decade of experience in managing projects funded by Chinese ODA in Egypt, and her research addresses topics including China's growing influence in the MENA region, China's economic presence in Africa, and U.S.-China competition in Africa. She holds a PhD in political economy from Cairo University. Next up is Paul Natulia. He's a research associate in the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. And Paul's areas of expertise include Chinese foreign policy, China-Africa relations, and the mediation and peace processes in the Great Lakes region, East and Southern Africa. And finally, we'll be hearing from Jeremy Mark, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center. Jeremy's a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa, who focuses on U.S.-China issues and developing country debt. And Jeremy has worked for the IMF as a communications specialist for more than 2 decades. So thank you all for joining us. To get things started, I'd like to invite each panelist to share 5 or 6 minutes of initial comments about the topic of today. And so, Yunnan, let's turn to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. And thanks so much to Atlantic Council for inviting and organizing the session. I think what I want to do is make sort of 3 very broad initial comments to kick off the discussion on this topic of the future of connectivity in the Global South, but I want to start by kind of going backwards. So the first point I want to make is that when we look back to the last decade of this debt-financed infrastructure that we've seen in the Global South, a lot of this is driven by China's own domestic economic transitions. And I would say that the future of these overseas projects will also be determined by what is happening domestically in China and the shape of the Chinese economy to come. What we call the Belt and Road Initiative can be characterized as many things, and I think we'll get into a great discussion on this later. But one characterization of it, as well as being a geostrategic project and a soft power project, it's also a kind of economic spatial fix. So what we saw after the global financial crisis in 2008 was this outpouring of capital from Chinese financial institutions and from Chinese firms overseas. And that really came from this economic stimulus that the government instilled after 2008. But what it led to aspects of excess capacity, an overheated economy, and an increasingly saturated domestic infrastructure market. So what we saw were Chinese SOEs who were facing an increasingly competitive domestic economic market, increasingly going overseas and acting as both as entrepreneurs, but also as political entrepreneurs in Africa and elsewhere, where governments had long-standing infrastructure wish lists that the World Bank or other Western donors and financiers were unable or unwilling to fund. And so Chinese SOEs played a key role in brokering this finance from Chinese development banks, China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, and the 2 main policy banks. But what this also means is that some of these projects that get financed, don't necessarily get the sufficient due diligence or the risk analysis as perhaps they should have done. And in later years, we've seen is more controversies arising from this. So in the second half of the decade, there has been a very visible slowdown in lending from China. And again, this is driven by some of these internal economic dynamics, not just these external controversies. And COVID, I think, of Chinese capital. And I think the future of infrastructure finance is also going to reflect what we're seeing in China now domestically. So the directions this can go in, I think, point to a growing expansion probably in the area of renewable energy, and also a growing willingness to explore the digital communications and telecoms markets. And so I think there is going to be a big transition in the Belt and Road to come. The second point I want to make is on the point around debt. And when it comes to debt, there's a lot of alarm bells that get rung when it involves China. But on the one hand, I would say emphatically, I would say China is not going to be seizing any ports in Africa anytime soon. But at the same time, we shouldn't think of China as a donor, and it is certainly not an actor driven by altruism. And really, in that second decade following the millennium, in the post-2008 era, there was a very significant change in character around the type of finance and the type of lending that we see from China. Much more commercially driven in character, both in the types of projects that we see and also in the way that loan contracts are structured. And this has also raised a lot of hackles from Western media observers around some of these more controversial clauses in these loan contracts. But I think what's important to emphasize is that the way that Chinese banks have designed these contracts is that they are designed to be repaid. In many ways, Chinese banks are more similar to what we might see from the private sector side, from commercial creditors, than from a sovereign state. But this has led to a lot of problematic issues when it comes to sovereigns in debt distress. The first, and this was also touched on in the previous panel, is this problem of transparency. Unless a country has a legal mandate to publish data around debt and loan contracts, all of these contracts tend to be very, very opaque, and they are not transparent. And this can lead to a lot of problems when it comes to debt renegotiations with multiple creditors, as we saw in the case of Zambia. The other problem is that renegotiations of debt with China is incredibly bureaucratic, and this has led to a very prolonged process in several cases, and as we're currently seeing for the countries that have taken part in the G20 Common Framework. Chinese banks, while they have participated, and while China has participated in a multilateral debt restructuring initiative, on the ground level, you still face these bureaucratic factors that can lead to a lot of problems for borrowers who are very fiscally constrained in the short term. The third point to close up is that I think COVID and these few years may represent a critical juncture for the shape of China's development finance to come. And really, I think there is, this is the end of this dominant model of debt-based infrastructure finance. And we saw this really in the last forum on China-Africa cooperation, where there was a significant cut in the grant component and the concessional loans components offered to African sovereigns. And the signal is much more in the future a transition to a private sector-led and commercially dominated form of cooperation, and perhaps signaling more use of innovative financial instruments and blended finance models. However, whether this is sufficient to really cover the very much needed, the huge infrastructure finance gap that exists in the global south and particularly in Africa is a big question. China has been one of the biggest contributors to infrastructure finance in the developing world, and despite its problems, this has been a huge boon to many economies in Africa and elsewhere. And if China is withdrawn from this market, it's not clear whether the Build Back Better world or the Global Gateway can really step in to fill that gap. And I'll conclude there for now. Thanks.
Well, that was fantastic, Yunans. Thank you so much. I mean, this discussion of the domestic influences in China's overseas policy is something I've always been fascinated with, and I think it's such an important but often overlooked aspect. So I'll certainly be circling back to you in the Q&A section to find out what, pray tell, are these domestic dynamics, and ask you to unpack that later. But for now, we're going to turn to our second panelist, and one of I think the true experts when it comes to issues of debt finance, particularly in Egypt, and issues of due diligence, Dr. Iman Farhai. So, Dr. Farhai, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you so much for everyone in the Atlantic Council for giving me such a chance. My humble contribution will be about mainly 3 points. The first one is about the Belt and Road Initiative and the concept of connectivity. When you look at the initiative or everything or anything related to it, you will find the word connectivity in everywhere and in each and every level, people to people level, and also infrastructure and economic development level. But I will also have something to share with you. When I was discussing with one of my several of my African colleagues who have been to China on training courses, and we were talking about South-South cooperation. Actually, they said one thing: how can we look at China as a country from the South? I mean, they said something that is funny and sad at the same time. They said, if China is a South country, then what can we call the African countries? It will be like, Sub-South or something, that a new term that will need to be invented. So that was actually the point that I am raising to move to another point, which is we're talking about a connectivity, but a lot of people see it as a connectivity between a core and periphery. The core is China, and the periphery is everything else. Every state else is a periphery. So what we're doing, or what China is trying to do through the BRI initiative, is that they are connecting the countries inside, geographically, internally, domestically, but eventually it will be on their own good, and they will also be it will also be very beneficial for them. The core and periphery thing leads me to an important thing, which is equality. There is a white paper that was issued by the Chinese side, and the title is China and Africa in the New Era, a Partnership of Equals. I will pause at the word equals. In the same paper, there is an interesting figure, and actually I think figures can talk. So this figure is going to talk more than I will. From 2016 till 2020, the total investments in infrastructure projects in Africa of China reached almost $20 billion. The project implemented by China and Chinese companies accounted for 31.4% of all the infrastructure projects in China. These two are figures that can not only talk, but they can scream. That's not equality, that's not equals. Because if all the African countries put all their economies together, they cannot invest and pour that much money, or even half of it, in China. So it's not equal, or not so equal in this sense. My second point is going to be about the loan policies of China. Actually, there is a lot of ambiguity that is going around the lending policies, and from time to time you hear they're going to take a port there, they're going to take an airport there. The last thing that we were hearing about was Entebbe Airport in Uganda, that they are going to seize it. I'm not going to say that we didn't see such events or such rumors from any other donors, whether they are bilateral donors or multilateral banks. I'm not also going to say that the agreements of loans, some of its articles cannot be disclosed because this is not only for China, it happens with other multilateral development partners and other donors also. But also, I will go to a figure that can talk. China's debt, or Angola's debt to China is $25 billion. Djibouti, more than 70% of Djibouti's GDP is actually indebted to China, if you translate that to numbers. Kenya's external debt, what's the figure? Oh, 72%. 72% of Kenya's external debt is to China. So this is a lot. These numbers and these figures are just scaring to be in one donor, in the hand of one country. That's just a bit odd, and it should give us some alarms. And also another point, whether the infrastructure-led growth policy that Africa has been depending on the last few decades, and of course it combined with the BRI, which is mostly about infrastructure, but has really the growth, has really the infrastructure projects led us to economic and social growth, or we were just making a road or making a railway or making a sanitation project without having that much of effect. My last point is about the future of the BRI and the B3W. The fact that China is becoming a major donor in Africa, there was some rationale behind the extensive and the excessive loan presence in Africa, China loans presence in Africa. In 2019, we started to see that the figures are going down and that the loans are not going that much. They are decreasing the amount of loans that they are giving to Africa. They are rationalizing the whole lending process. Why? Because of the internal and domestic circumstances. Because of also after that 2020 and later on the COVID-19 that has been hitting everyone, everyone's economy. And they are also facing a problem because what I call the loan fever in Africa has started to have other symptoms. Some countries cannot repay the loans. It's a fact. But why they cannot repay the loans? Because the loans was not very much studied before they give it. They were just, having a fever to give all the loans at all the time. Okay, they are telling me that I need to finish up. I talk too much. So the last thing I'm going to say is that China could be going to a lot of commercial loans, which is going to be much more burden on the African countries. And also they could be going to blended finance, as Ms. Chen was talking about, but this will also have a lot of restrictions, but that would be it. That would be it. I will not talk too much. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Iman. As usual, you hit some great high points, and this discussion of China as the metropole. This idea of all roads lead to China in the PRI. I mean, this goes back to even concepts of the Middle Kingdom and the Silk Road. I mean, in part, this is the thing that inspired. So I think that the fact that you see it being created is to some degree suggests maybe a success. But we can talk more about that. Because at the same time, you also suggest that there may be, rather than a win-win, maybe a lose-lose if, as Yunan says, folks want to get paid back. But as you say, especially in African context, maybe they can't necessarily pay back, then maybe the win-win turns to a lose-lose. And we can see what bankers in Beijing, think about that in a few years. But so much to discuss here. But first, we have to hear from a true expert, Paul Lantulia. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josh. I'm not sure if I'm the true expert, but I'm very glad to be here with my colleagues. I've read a lot From them, I've learned a lot from them. Yunnan, I've really dug deep into your work that you did on the SGR in Kenya and other pieces of work. So it's a real honor for me to be joining you this evening. And thank you to the Atlantic Council as well. I think what I'm going to do is I'll just basically keep my remarks very short, and I'll focus on 4 main items at a macro level. Then we can discuss the specifics in the question and answer discussion. The first is that the Belt and Road, I mean, just in terms of my own analysis, my work on this, when you follow the policy documents, when you read them, when you look at the debates that are taking place in China, within government circles, within the private sector, SOEs, and when you talk to African officials, and you talk to African think tanks, because that's another segment of the China-Africa community that tends not to receive a lot of media coverage. The sense you get is that the Belt and Road is here to stay. So the African side understands. Perhaps it's not very clear what form it might take. There's a significant section of the China-Africa community that says, the Belt and Road is an evolving animal, quite unpredictable, can be shaped in different ways. For instance, the extension of the SGR from Naivasha to the Uganda border is on ice. Nobody expected that. So unpredictable, nobody knows, no one can really, and when you talk to Chinese colleagues as well, it's kind of like, you get a sense that it's a work in progress. However, it's a project, it's much more than an economic project. There's a lot of political clout behind it. When you look at the people that are involved, when you look at the statements that are being made, one gets the sense that this initiative is here to stay. Very much bound up with the legacy of Xi Jinping, although he is by no means the initiator, because the discussions on setting up a modern Silk Road started during the years of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao as well. There was a lot of discussion around that. So, and at that point, they were really thinking about Asia, but then it really had this expansive focus under Xi Jinping. So, I think that's the first thing that I would say. It has been heavily socialized in the foreign policy establishment, very institutionalized within the policy apparatus. So you look at the small leading groups, and look at the people that are on that leading group. You're going to have people from the Politburo Standing Committee, sort of the usual suspects, Wang Huning, who's an old Africa hand, Yang Jishe as well, who's very well known on the continent. Hu Chunhua, everybody believes that he might actually make it to the Politburo Standing Committee and the next Congress, which happens this year. It's a major year for China, and also going to be a major year in terms of the future of the Belt and Road. So, and then, you have a whole cast of characters like Zhang Gaoli, who is embroiled in this scandal with the tennis player. Pang Shuhei. So, heavy hitters, and that is certainly a signal in and of itself. And these are signals that are received on the Africa side. These are signals that are received in Asia, because these are individuals that interact very, very closely and have got sort of intergenerational ties with different elites from the global south. So heavily socialized, and there are very many very powerful domestic incentives. I mean, I was trying to go through a list of the number of academic institutions that have started Belt and Road programs. Belt and Road master. You can now go to China and on a degree program, you can do a master's in Belt, what they call Belt and Road studies. Almost everybody is opening these programs. Then there's short-term training programs for the Belt and Road. Some of these programs are being offered in countries like Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, and other places, right? Executive programs, short-term programs, and so forth. Some of them are just purely private money-making initiatives, but one can get a sense that there's that bottom-up, there's that ground-up pressure, right? Private sector, such as it is in China, because that's also a loaded term in the Chinese context, but academic institutions and so forth. So, they've been able to get this sort of like domestic aspect of it, right? To sort of, it's a self kind of conceptually a self-sustaining kind of initiative. If you want to get policy attention, and this very competitive system out there, provinces are competing to get market access with different countries. Municipalities are concluding agreements with different African countries or Asian countries as well. There's that in that sense of competition. As long as you can frame an initiative within the context of Belt and Road, then chances are you're going to get policy attention. You're going to get a bit of money. So these are just elements that support my thesis that the Belt and Road is here to stay. The second point that I'll make is that as much as it's here to stay, I think there's a conversation that is going on in China and in the global South about the financing mix. So you've got all these stories about seizure of assets. Now, no assets have been seized, as Yunnan pointed out. No ports have been seized, but these are stories that get a life of their own. They grow legs, and you find stories like that swirling around. Seizure of the Entebbe airport in Uganda, and these sorts of things. The port, the Mombasa port in Kenya, and these are very emotional things, right? I mean, I was talking to a group of leaders just this morning from Mombasa on the Belt and Road, and almost all the questions were around this port. So one gets the sense that the Chinese side is reacting to this bottom-up pressure. So when they say things like, we're going to now, we're going to set up a debt sustainability framework. We're going to set up a framework for corporate social responsibility, sort of using the same terms that would be used in the West, which is very interesting because these are targeted at particular audiences. You get a sense that there's that pressure. However, there are also very powerful domestic elements, and sort of there's a consensus within the China-Africa community that there's just not the money that was there before is just not there anymore, and there are many domestic imperatives. A huge component, and I think one of my colleagues mentioned that at the beginning, that foreign policy and domestic policy are very much connected in China. So there's some domestic issues, and one also has to acknowledge the fact that there's not a whole lot of public support, again, for this outward-facing Belt and Road, because some of the Belt and Road elements are internal to China, sort of getting those markets together and so forth. But the external-facing aspect of the Belt and Road has received some fairly critical, such as it is, critical reviews. When you look at the comments that the discussions that take place on Chinese social media. So I think this moving towards a more diverse financing mix, private sector. This Dakar Action Plan is all about private sector, approaching international lenders like the World Bank, sort of having a better mix and sort of burden sharing. I think this, there's some signals that have been sent on the Chinese side. The other element that I'll talk about very briefly is the security aspect of it, right? We're now seeing the Belt and Road sort of looking at security issues, right? So the police commandos that were sent recently, the Chinese police commandos that conducted a joint operation with the Ugandan counterparts, for instance, on the ground, the dispatching of Chinese CID to Nigeria, which came as a result of pressure from the Chinese Nigerian community as a result of these increasing attacks against Chinese SOEs and Chinese communities. We're seeing similar situations in the DRC and a move towards sort of a law enforcement cooperation between the PRC and African countries. I mean, the Ethiopian MOU, for instance, and other countries as well. I mean, the Pakistanis have deployed 15,000 troops to protect projects along the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So I think you're going to see a lot more of this. And this also contributes to that staying power that I was talking about earlier. And then finally, responding to Build Back Better and the global gateway, I think, the Chinese culture, the concept of face, losing face, gaining face, China has been able to secure a position as the most important partner, one of the most important partners to the global South countries as far as it comes to when it comes to infrastructure. There's a sense that well, certainly when you talk to the African side, there's a sense that you get that the African side does not believe that the Chinese will want to cede that position easily, right? So I think what the EU and the US initiatives are going to do, I think they're going to force the Chinese side and the African side and countries of the global South to go back to the drawing board. China is unlikely to cede that easily, and I think that might be an opportunity to exercise agency on the part of host governments, right? If you have now the field is getting crowded, right? Initially it was just China, but now you have others coming on board. The Japanese have been there. The Indians have been there. That might be able to that might provide countries greater options, greater policy options, a greater mix of financing instruments, right? So it might be an opportunity to exercise a bit of agency. And I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was great. And especially starting off by letting us know that BRI is here to stay, because there are certainly folks who talk about BRI as if it's a policy of the past, and so it's good to hear, and also the diversity of interests and pressures going on domestically, especially at the political level. So you've got firms which are engaged in BRI and who want to see it continue, but you've got the average person on the street who says, well, all of these BRI students are filling slots at the university. What about my kid, right? And so you have these cross currents going on in China, also at the elite level you discussed, and this move towards a more security and I would say political oriented nature of BRI, which reminds us fundamentally the Communist Party of China, which runs China, is a political institution first and foremost, not an economic one. And we should always remember that as we have these discussions. So finally, then, we're going to turn, last but not least, to Jeremy Marks. And Jeremy, working at the IMF, we've seen some of the data on the China's economy recently, not predicted to grow as fast. And maybe that has something to do with Yunnan's pessimism in terms of the growth of BRI going forward. But why don't I turn to you and maybe fill us in?
Thank you, Josh. Perhaps we can come back to the Chinese economy during our discussion. I'd like to thank everybody for making such insightful comments and leaving me with very little to say at this point on the topic. It really is an honor to be here today, and I thank my colleagues at the Council for inviting me. What I want to do is focus in on the debt crisis, because I think Yunnan and other colleagues have already done a very good job of laying out the broader picture. I guess the point to make is I fully agree that the debt trap narrative is a fallacy that has been overplayed, but there is a debt trap involving Chinese lending. It's one that we've seen over and over again in recent years. It's one in which borrowers overborrow and creditors overlend. Debt sustainability it becomes a thing of the past, and pretty soon a debt crisis emerges. In this case, COVID did more than anything else, brought it on, but it was already developing before 2020, and I think the Chinese knew that. 2014, I was in Mozambique as part of an IMF visit. We paid a courtesy call on the Chinese embassy there, and we met with a mid-level official who was talking about their lending and investment in Mozambique, which at that time everybody thought was going to be the next fill in the blank, the next great success story. Of course, that wasn't the case. And he turned to us and he said, "Does the IMF do debt sustainability studies?" It had reached the point relatively early in this flood of lending that Chinese officials on the ground, Chinese officials in Beijing, were suddenly realizing that this was going fast and far beyond capabilities. And of course, the IMF and many other institutions did a great deal of debt sustainability work because, of course, just 15 years earlier, there had been a debt crisis involving IMF, World Bank, and other sovereign lending that had produced a major debt relief program for many low-income countries. And one end result was debt sustainability became a subject that was vast amounts of bureaucratic resources were devoted to. Now, the fact is, while the embassies on the ground may have not known it, in Beijing, there were certainly people who were very aware of debt sustainability issues and the analysis that was being done, and particularly at the People's Bank of China. And later that year, in 2014, I had a chance to join a meeting in Beijing with the PBOC, and they talked about debt sustainability, the work they were doing, and they said, well, you know, we proposed internally to join the Paris Club recently. The Paris Club being the informal gathering of Western lenders and donor countries that work with the IMF, World Bank, and other organizations in debt crisis situations to restore debt viability to a country. And what we were told in Beijing was, well, we really did want to do this, but people up the ladder said, no, it wasn't going to happen. And I think by implication, what I've learned subsequently is that this was fairly senior political decision that was made for various reasons, that China did not want to be put in a position of resolving future debt problems in a multilateral setting. They wanted flexibility to do it in bilateral terms. I think ideologically at this point, we were already starting to see China move somewhat away from some of the elements of international cooperation that had been pursuing earlier. I think we saw a lot of this go further under Xi Jinping as he consolidated his rule. China began to experience debt problems in its lending, particularly when oil prices started falling sharply, 2000, 2018. We saw Congo have to restructure, Republic of Congo have to restructure, and it got very awkward because at that point, because of non-disclosure clauses in the agreements, you were alluding to it earlier, the previous panel alluded to this issue. Congo was not able to show the IMF information about its Chinese debts. And there was a long delay and a lot of back and forth to work out how to do this. And it really took over a year to reach an agreement because of the non-transparency. Basically, what has changed things has been COVID. You've touched on it. Yunnan touched on it. The breadth and the depth of the debt problems that emerged because of COVID, the rapidity with which so many countries went into debt crisis, caused a lot of changes in policy. Of course, it came out of the G20. We've also alluded to that. There was the moratorium on debt service payments and the common framework for restructuring. China was really pretty supportive of the debt service side of things. China had a long history of enabling payments to be delayed and extended out and such. But debt restructuring has posed much more serious problems for the bureaucracy, which has not been used to this. I think politically, the leadership has not addressed debt reduction, i.e. haircuts, nearly as much as other countries have been forced to with previous debt crises. And I think that as a result, it has been a much slower process for China. It's very important to note that this is not just a question of China. China is certainly the largest sovereign lender to the countries now facing debt problems, but the private sector in the West, bondholders and commercial lenders have all become major creditors leading up to the COVID crisis. And a lot of what's being faced now is not just related to decisions that have to be made on a bilateral basis about specific countries, but also this interaction that's taking place where, in essence, you have two sets of semi-transparent lenders who are jockeying to see who's going to reveal more first and who's going to take a bigger haircut. My understanding from talking to former colleagues is that the restructuring that involves debt reduction from the Chinese point of view is a very political issue. It's addressed on a case-by-case basis. It is not up to the lending institutions, be it Exim Bank, China Development Bank, or others. Rather, the decision on whether there is going to be a haircut has to go to a much more senior level and be addressed on a case-by-case by political leadership. And thus, it's become very slow. We've seen it in various countries. Yunnan referred to Zambia, where, of course, the private sectors are a crucial issue. Private sector lenders are a crucial issue. But we've seen it in quote unquote simpler cases. For example, recently in Suriname, where a debt reduction involving about $1 billion in loans from Exim Bank was delayed for 8 months after an IMF program was reached last year. And it was only at Christmas that they began to move towards some solutions that allowed the IMF to finally, after 8 months, lend money to Suriname. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this because more and more countries are facing difficulties, even though, for example, oil prices are high at the moment. Other natural resources whose revenue helps to sustain the debt payments, other natural resources prices are falling. And I could go on with this. There's a lot of different aspects, but probably best to stop here, let Josh raise questions, and let my colleagues speak as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. That was great. And, it's especially interesting to hear about how Chinese friends go into these things to some degree with their eyes wide open. I remember in 2017, Ambassador Shin and I interviewed somebody at the NDRC, which was in charge of the Belt and Road Initiative. And they were very frank. And I said, because I had just published an article called China's Belt and Road is getting muddy, or China's road is getting muddy, or something in foreign policy. And I said, do you think we're being too pessimistic here? And he read the article. It was a short article. And he said, no, you're far too optimistic if my worst case scenarios are correct. And so I don't know if his worst case scenarios have come true. We haven't talked about it. But I was really shocked with the fact that, as you say, Chinese friends weren't foolish about this, although I did find that some had drunk the Kool-Aid in terms of this idea that the West was inherently unfair to the Global South, that Western lending institutions would not treat Global South countries fairly, which, I've always been of the mind that Wall Street bankers will lend money to anyone they think they're going to make money from, right? They're in the business of money making. And if they think they can make money, they will. So there's no discrimination in that. But it seems that now we find ourselves in a situation where perhaps that political narrative was not correct. And now people are having to maybe eat a bit of crow. Now, let me turn to a question here. I want to ask to kind of put to all of you, and maybe we'll go in reverse order. And that's the question of how optimistic are we about the BRI? What grade would you give the BRI if you were a professor? A to F. And then how optimistic are you? With the most optimistic being a 10. Going forward about the BRI. I'm curious also the metrics you might use to grade the program, since it's both an economic, political, and, as we say, a military program. And then a special one for Iman when she answers. Iman is the one of us on this call who's actually been privy to these contracts, worked on them herself. So as I understand it, Egypt's contracts with China are open. They are transparent. And so maybe you could talk to us about why Egypt is able to keep these open and transparent, and why you believe other African countries and other countries in the Global South have not been able to have transparency in their agreements. So you can take that as part of your ranking. But Jeremy, maybe you could start us off. We'll go in reverse order. So you, then Paul, Iman, and then back to Yunnan.
Well, I'm the only person here who doesn't have a PhD, so I don't know anything about grading. Anybody who has spent time stuck in traffic in Nairobi or Lagos or in the middle of Java, anybody who has flown over Africa at night and seen how little power generation there really is, you have to give China, I think, a great deal of credit for the willingness to proceed to help meet this massive need for infrastructure in the developing world. So I think right there you get sort of a gentleman's C out of it. I would say the problem has been what I was talking about, is that the debt issue is not going to be easily solved. And I really worry that a lot of projects will stall, or important projects that were on the drawing board will not get the funding they need. On the other hand, I don't think that Build Back Whatever and related projects are likely to provide much in the way of substitute financing for countries that really do need to continue this kind of investment. So I think whatever occurs in terms of the shift to green projects or connectivity, at the end of the day, China probably deserves a B for what it's done, although that may deteriorate in time.
And your optimism going forward?
Less optimistic. I think that the global economic situation is going to dictate more than anything else. I think the debt issues are going to be huge. And I think that for all the talk of my former colleagues that they're not going to impose conditionality on countries that are borrowing, I think there is going to be a reckoning going forward in terms of the bills that have to be paid. So I'm fairly pessimistic.
Great. Paul?
As difficult as it is to believe, I don't yet have a PhD. Maybe this is something I need to discuss with Josh, because it's been very difficult to focus my mind on that, in addition to doing all these other things. But thank you for the compliment. I always get emails, Professor Nantulia, Dr. Nantulia, and I'm like, okay. So look, I think I would give it a B-. And the reason I say that is, when you talk to African private sector leaders, when you talk to professionals in the Ministry of Finance in these different African countries, what they tell you is, look, there are many problems with these offers. There are many problems. The confidentiality agreements and all these things. Sometimes, there's just no capacity. I mean, there was a Kenyan technocrat the other day who was like, man, if only we can just get a program that can help us help develop our negotiation. I mean, these guys are tough negotiators. And you walk into a negotiation and the Chinese side, I mean, they're changing individuals like every 30 minutes. You get a fresh face. You're sitting there the whole day, just one person taking notes, listening. It's extremely difficult. There's just no capacity. Some countries are better than others, right? The Mauritians are good. The Seychelles, very good. But other countries, I mean, it's just not. I mean, with Kenya, it's just a surprise. It's a surprise. A country like that has a lot of capacity outside government, So, but putting that aside, there's a sense that, look, with structural adjustment, right? I mean, they had this Lagos Plan of Action from 1980 to 2000. This Lagos Plan of Action. And if you look at the Lagos Plan of Action, it's about its energy, its power, its infrastructure, right? Industrialization. They were not able to get that off the ground because they hit a block with structural adjustment, right? Which does not put money in hard infrastructure. It just doesn't, right? So they had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new concept. And it was just interesting. They came up with this concept, this program for the development of infrastructure. In 2012, the Africa Development Bank and others. And that was by coincidence, that was the year that the Belt and Road took off. So it was no surprise that by 2015, they had negotiated an MOU with China to route some of the BRI offer into infrastructure. So when it comes to that, I think it's a B-. Namely, the Chinese have put political will, they've put political clout into investing, providing finance, because some of it is investment, some of it is finance, some of loan financing, into a sector that is considered a strategic priority, not just by government, but by the private sector. So I think I would give it a B- in that sense. In terms of going forward, I'm a little, I'm not as confident because one, COVID is with us. COVID is going to continue. COVID has really had a major impact, on the economy. So I'm very worried about that. I'm very worried about how prepared. I mean, we're talking about, shifting the model from governments to private sectors. I'm very worried. I don't know how organized the private sectors are. The private sectors on the African continent, how organized they will be, right, to partake of this. So it remains to be seen. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. Now let's go to a true doctor, Dr. Farhai. You can, who received her, as I said, PhD recently. We're thrilled. So what do you think? How would you grade so far? And how is Egypt able to keep these contracts transparent while others, as we heard Venezuela as well, working so hard to keep them private, right? Egypt achieving something others haven't. So.
Okay. Before I say the grade, I will have to say that we have to link our vision to the future of the BRI to how flexible the BRI is going to be. Now we are all taking the COVID hit, and in the last FOCAC meeting in last November, President Xi was talking about lots of initiatives to make the partnership with Africa more real and more of a win-win situation, which means that the Chinese are having a vision that there is an imbalanced relation between China and Africa. And there is also one point here, is that I think that we could be seeing a shift from the infrastructure fever and the loan fever towards a private sector mobilization to mobilize the resources and the money and the funds from the private sector, not only to fund the infrastructure projects, but also the concentration, in my own humble opinion, will be on SMEs. I think this is going to be a creative way for China to overcome and to be more flexible in trying to sustain the BRI. I also have one thing to say here also. Maybe the BRI, in my own humble opinion, will be doing better than the B3W because it has been going for quite some time now, and there are backed with some governmental funds, but the American initiative is not backed with governmental funds. It's all about mobilizing the private sector resources. This itself, it addresses Africa's concern of being in a debt trap or overload with debt, but it's also a constraint on the other side, because how you're going to mobilize all these tremendous funds only from the private sector. This is also a main constraint that I think the US and should try to think of how to get over with, maybe public-private partnership or blended finance or some other mechanism that can work on that. So that's what I would say, and I would say I'm quite I'm quite pessimistic regarding the BRI. I think they could continue, but they will not be as strong as it was, because as I was saying, and actually as all the esteemed colleagues were saying, there is profound challenges inside China, internally and globally, and most importantly internally, because the internal front, if it's strong, then you can take a hit from the outside. But the internal situation in China now is not as it was 10 years ago. It's not that strong. There are many challenges that they need to address, like the Africans, like the Americans. So I would say I'm a bit pessimistic. Regarding your question about Egypt and the loans, Here we have to differentiate between two types of loans: the governmental loans and the commercial loans. The commercial loans have nothing to do with the government. The government cannot oversee them, but the governmental loans, of course, the government sees them. And we in Egypt, when we acquire a loan from China or from whatever donor it is, we have to make it a public. We have to have a public release or saying that we have acquired, or we have signed an agreement with partner X with an amount of $1 billion, for example. And the financial terms, maybe it's not that open there, but at least you know that you have taken a loan from this country. So this is something that we have to do. It's not something that we negotiate. Why other African countries are not doing that? I'm not. Actually, this question brings us to something that is really profound in China and Africa relations, which is corruption. Corruption is both ways. It's not only in Africa, it's not only in China, it's everywhere. But even some Chinese scholars have been saying that corruption has made development process a bit easier sometimes. So when we're looking at it from this perspective, then yes, some elites in some countries, they could be benefiting one way or another from the loans, or they could be benefiting one way or another from having a company that will be benefiting from the loan construction or something, the construction of the project. So it varies, but mainly it's because of corruption. Another reason also, sometimes the Chinese would not allow you to. Sometimes there will be an article in the agreement or in the contract stating that you cannot publish it, or you cannot talk about it. But definitely in the internal governmental circle, everything should be discussed. I mean, there is no secret paper for the government. They all have to see it as long as they are going to sign it. But the commercial loans, that's a major trap. The financial terms are very high. And no one knows exactly how much the Chinese have been giving commercial loans to African countries. I even don't know what the figure is, and I don't know how even to get it. So this is also a very important topic, that commercial loans, that we don't even know how much it is.
Yeah, that is, thank you so much for raising that point, Iman. I mean, that is the kind of the bomb we don't even know about, right? It's a known unknown, and that is really scary. And especially if somebody who works on these issues like yourself doesn't know where to get that data, I think that leaves us in a difficult position. And the issue of corruption, I think it's worth mentioning here. Corruption is not agency, okay? You exploit others using your position. You exploit an opportunity. That's not African countries' agency or a developing countries' agency. That is an exploitation of their position. And I think sometimes we have to separate these two things out and be coherent about it. So this leaves us, Yunan, you're going to have the last word here. So I wonder if you can give a grade to the BRI, let us know what you think. And also maybe, a bit of discussion here at the end about Iman's point about the B3W and whether or not you see B3W as a true competitor, and whether or not the US can or ought to be a competitor in this space.
Thanks, Josh. So, how do you grade a project where there are no goalposts? This is the question I would put back to you, right? Like, this is a game where the goalposts keep shifting. So, whilst I think projects along the Belt and Road, you could grade a range from B, D, C. In the ones that I've seen, there are a lot of problems and issues, but others, have functioned quite well. I think the overall PR success of the BRI, I would grade an A. Right? It's just it's endemic in every aspect of China's global engagement. And it's something that everyone knows. It's become probably the most effective brand label that China has projected in the last decade. But as to what we think of the BRI, that I think is going to change. So we've been talking a lot about sort of hard infrastructure over this session, And when we talk about the BRI, a lot of that is implicitly talking about the roads, railways, ports that we're all used to. And a lot of that, I think, has been damaged even prior to COVID, but especially like in the aftermath of COVID. I think a lot of that financing, the ability of African sovereigns to take out finance to support that kind of infrastructure investment, that is going to diminish significantly. However, the BRI is not about roads or hard infrastructure. The BRI is about connectivity ultimately, and there are many different kinds of connectivity. So the digital space, I think, is going to be the new frontier of where the BRI goes. And this is something that's already been pushed quite strongly in the recent FOCAC and in what China is investing in overall in its telecom sector. The potential for e-commerce as the new avenue for trade, the potential for the digital sector to grow, for the initiatives like digital currencies and the expansion of the potential, not just an e-CNY, but an e-RMB, a Chinese digital currency to become an exported financial instrument is something I think to look into in the future. And also in the wake of COVID as well, obviously health diplomacy has become a huge part of China's Belt and Road, and also its engagement with the global South as well. So it's something that has never taken one form. It's always been nebulous, and this has kind of been an advantage, because how can you say something has failed when you can't really pinpoint what it is, and one decade it looks completely different to the next. So I'm not pessimistic. I think I would err a little less pessimistic than some of my colleagues here. I think maybe we see the end of one phase of what we call the Belt and Road Initiative, but we are going to see a different form in the years to come. And I agree with what Iman raised about this kind of a turning back to the private sector, this rise of private investment of enterprises as the future of this kind of China-Africa cooperation. And I'll point to another acronym, which is the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, that has also recently been launched by Xi Jinping as well. We have the BRI, and now we have the GDI, and the GDI is a lot more focused as well on this kind of private sector collaboration. I also wanted to address your point on the loan transparency and to kind of second what Iman said, right? It's a corruption issue, but it's also ultimately, it relies on host country governance. Most commercial contracts are confidential, and this is because both creditor and borrower have a huge incentive to keep it confidential. If you don't know the loan terms, you can negotiate perhaps a better rate. You don't want your competitors to know how much you're lending or at what rate you're lending to this borrower versus another one, because by making it transparent, you reduce your bargaining power. But if you are in a country where the law requires that loan contracts be published or be scrutinized by parliamentary approval, the Chinese contract does not override that. So this is pointed out by an AData CGD article. When you have well-established institutions of transparency and accountability, you can have that. You can have that visibility, right? That confidentiality is not an issue. So it really depends on the host country institutions and governance fundamentally as to kind of how this kind of morass around contracts play out. And the final point on the B3W, I would also agree with Iman that I don't see it as a competitor. Like the B3W, the global gateway, they're so explicitly motivated by geopolitics rather than, I think, actual intrinsic positive potential of African economies. And there is, and this is something that Chinese private sector and state sector recognizes, that there is a huge market. There are commercial opportunities in Africa. But from Western actors, the creation of these initiatives is very much a way of kind of a political bat to swing at China. And unfortunately, you know, what the US and what Europe lacks is this kind of coordinated system of finance to mobilize private sector actors to go to Africa. American companies are going to be far more risk averse. They don't have the same appetite for risk as a Chinese state-owned enterprise might. They're not going to be as susceptible to incentives to go to riskier markets in the same way that a Chinese SOE might. And so while the money might be on the table, how you crowd in the private sector is going to be a huge challenge, I think.
Well, that's a great way to end it. You know, risk is such a nebulous concept, right? What is risky and what is not. You know, with that, I think that's about the end of our discussion in this panel. Thank you all to this great group of panelists for their outstanding insights and analysis. And you know, I'm sure we could keep going for, you know, hours more here, but instead what we're going to do is take a short break, about 5 minutes or so, and about 4:30 or so, we're going to get started in our final panel. So hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Hello, everyone. We're back for our final panel session of the day, and it's one that I hope will provide the ideal close to today's conference by providing our audience actionable insights on building resilience to ensure that as countries across the global south deepen engagement with China, which as we heard from our last panel, we should expect, political and business leaders and civil society and private enterprise and others are able to reap the potential benefits of that engagement with China that we've heard about, while mitigating against the risks that we've also discussed today. So in the interest of time, I'd like to jump in and introduce our excellent panelists. We have first, Dr. Emmanuel Mutombo, Senior Researcher at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. Dr. Mutombo is an expert in China-Africa relations, particularly between China and Zambia. And I should note that he's also an Atlantic Council Millennium Leadership Fellow. Next, we have Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan, an associate at Harvard's Asia Center and visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. As part of her research into Asia-Africa relations, Veda has conducted extensive fieldwork across geographies, including Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Ethiopia, India, and China. And finally, we have Bulelani Jili, a visiting fellow in Yale Law School's Information Society Project, and a fellow in the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative within our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Bulelani has deep expertise on Africa-China relations and cybersecurity, particularly the exportation of Chinese surveillance technology in Africa. Thank you to all three of you for joining us today. I'd like to start by inviting each of you to deliver a few brief opening remarks, and we'll start with Dr. Mutombo.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you very much to the University of Notre Dame and the Atlantic Council for inviting me. And I'm honored to share this panel with Veda and Bulelani. I hope that we'll have a fruitful engagement. Obviously, these are just brief remarks before I go into my main research, but I think what is of utmost importance to note at the moment is that there is a growing dimension to Africa-China relations that was not there even about 24 years ago, I think from 1998, when China started coming up with a going out policy. And that dimension is the importance of non-state actors in shaping or influencing the relationship that Africa shares with China. So in as much as we are inclined to look at statecraft and the role of the elite in shaping Africa's relationship with China, we should also pay more attention to just how civil societies, trade unions, and the youth are actually shaping the relationship that Africa and the global South shares with China. So this is just my preparation for what I'm going to present when I give my remark. And there is actually a lot of pushback against the nefarious effects of China's relationship with Africa. So it is not just one-sided, but also at the same time, we should also make sure that we do not succumb as Africans into racialism that is usually hidden as an agency when we are demonizing or condemning China's concerning effects on Africa. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. So next, I'd like to turn to Veda.
Thanks, Dave. It's really nice to be here and share the panel with Emmanuel and Bulelani. And I'm glad Emmanuel actually brought up civil society organizations, because that's something that I thought I'd talk about a little bit in depth. So I'm going to draw from my experience of spending the last few years examining localized impacts of China's engagement across different countries and industries. So what's interesting about civil society organizations is that some have started mobilizing expertise and developing credibility to inform their respective host governments on how to approach China. And this in turn has sort of helped these governments exercise their agency. So this is something that I'm studying. And what is really interesting to me is traditionally, as we know, civil society organizations or CSOs, they have advocated for communities that live in regions that have foreign investments. We know this. They have helped monitor foreign investments on behalf of the public. We know this as well. And a lot of the times, like we saw when one of the Chinese companies tried to build infrastructure in, I think, the Tsavo National Park in Kenya, and tried mining in another park in Zimbabwe, there were civil society organizations that actually took legal action, they led protests, and finally these projects were put on hold. But now, interestingly, civil society organizations are also becoming key knowledge producers. So they are conducting research at the grassroots. They're working with local universities and local scholars. They're generating evidence, which is then used to inform and equip policymakers to eventually negotiate better deals with China. So for actors like the US and India, who are seeking to encourage transparency and accountability, especially around Chinese investments, one valuable intervention, I think, would be to identify genuine CSOs, to create organic collaborations, and find different ways to empower these organizations. But I'd also like to throw 4 other focused interventions before I end. One is to boost technical capacity. So again, I'm going to focus a lot of what I'm saying on what can other countries and other partners active in Africa do, in light of the fact that Chinese engagement across countries and industries are becoming increasingly complicated and nuanced. So I think Paul and Antulia referred to this in the last panel about how technical capacity is sometimes lacking and it's not uniform across countries. So in my interviews with government officials in Kenya and Tanzania, one thing that kept coming up was about the challenges involved in negotiating with the Chinese, right? So some of them had even relied on lawyers from Singapore to actually help them negotiate the final deals. Similarly, in these huge mega projects, some of them that I'd studied in Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam, they had project coordinators who were supposed to mediate between the host African client state and the Chinese contractor. And often these mediators were either German firms or French firms. So there was a clear need for capacity in technical aspects. The third point I actually wanted to throw out was the fact that we need to shift the conversation from aid to investments. And even within investments, into the role of the small and middle enterprises. Because again, when I spoke to officials at the Zambia Investment Agency or the Kenya Investment Agency, they told me about how they had put together teams to do these road shows in China, where they go to different provinces in China, and they would pitch to these potential investors about why they should invest in a Zambia or a Kenya or an Ethiopia. And they were really looking to create joint ventures. To the extent that the Zambia Development Agency had even hired a Chinese citizen who spoke the language to help them sort of iron out differences that arose during communication. So this is an area, again, where investments are needed. A lot of these countries have come out with vision reports that actually identify sectors that need these investments. And I think this could be a good starting point to have an alternate discussion about focused investments or channeling focused investments. The fourth point is about finding new solutions and new tools to fix problems that have traditionally been complex. So you have nonprofits like NextLeaf Analytics. They use data to drive country-led solutions and improve global health. You have companies like Sama, who hire people from low-income backgrounds in East Africa and offer them training in AI and machine learning. And they are systematically recognizing and building tech talent in Africa. So these are just examples, but we already have innovative nonprofits and companies that are going out there and are using innovative interventions like tech, for instance, to solve otherwise old problems. So that's an area I think that deserves more imagination and thought. And finally, I'd also talk about specific sectors that need investments. So the 2 sectors that I've studied in depth are agriculture and pharmaceutical manufacturing. So agriculture, like you all probably know, it accounts for over 20% of the continent's GDP. It employs over 60% of the people. It's a huge $1 trillion market. It's supposed to be a $1 trillion market by 2030. But if you look at the Africa's agribusiness sector, the promise is incredible, but the investments levels are very, very marginal. And similar with pharmaceutical manufacturing. The entire continent has over 300 pharmaceutical companies, but there are only 3 countries that produce vaccines. So in my interviews with agribusiness companies and pharma manufacturers, one thing that kept coming up is that it's not just the core manufacturing that has potential, but the allied industries around it are also, need huge amounts of investment. So, for instance, ZAF Pharmaceuticals was a joint venture between an Ethiopian company and 2 Chinese companies. And they talked about how when they started their joint venture, there wasn't places for them to store their material. They didn't have, the needed resources to transport their medicines. They didn't have warehouses which were temperature controlled. So they talked about, opportunities across the value chain. And this is something when we design or send business delegations or we design projects, I think we need to look beyond the large or broad brushstrokes and sort of look at a sector and specific aspects of the value chain in a sector. So to sort of conclude, a lot of today's conversations, I was listening to it from 2 in the afternoon today, was that there is a want to deliver options for African actors. And we've been discussing the B3W and the BRI, and that's very interesting and that's very important, and I've written about it myself. But I think it's also sometimes important to look at local contexts, right? Seek out country and industry specific priorities. Engage subnational actors, and this could include local governments, this could include CSOs, and we need to find innovative ways to prioritize accountability and transparency, not just sort of talk about it in a theoretical, abstract sort of a sense. So that's a few points that I wanted to put out there for discussion. Thank you.
That was great, Veda. I was taking lots of notes and I think we hopefully can dig into a lot of that in our conversation. So last but certainly not least, over to Bulelani for his opening remarks.
Yeah, sure. So I'll also try and aim to keep some of my opening remarks quite brief. I'm really kind of trying to think through both some of the opportunities, but also some of the ways in which US actors can actually support thinking about data protection on the continent. My work in particular thinks a lot about both the kind of distribution of surveillance technologies, but also the necessary infrastructure in the tech space that enables those activities. And what is quite obvious when thinking from the vantage point of local actors is the gap between data protection measures that are currently available in the local context versus the application of surveillance technologies. And what is particularly most wanted is thinking more actively and more robustly about the checks and balances that are necessary, both in order to preserve civil liberties, while simultaneously also aiming to instrumentalize and utilize these technologies for domestic and developmental ambitions. Obviously, those ambitions range from country to country, but a lot of them speak of these technologies as instruments towards development. And obviously, those kind of markers are most noted in discussions surrounding security, but also administrative capacities domestically. And so as we're thinking about how to be more active with local actors, it's paramount to realize the kind of contextually contingent outcomes of these local ambitions and actors. And I'll leave it there. And I hope to kind of speak more lucidly about what's been mentioned here.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah, I feel like each of you kind of did a great job of covering these specific areas, and I'd like to maybe dig in a bit more with each of you and then open it up to the rest of the panel to answer the questions as well. But maybe we'll go in reverse order. For Bulelani, you were just talking about the increasing role of technology in China's relations in Africa and also presumably throughout the global South. And some concerns that come up, of course, about Chinese ICT companies like Huawei in Africa and other parts of the developing world, as well as surveillance technology and those issues. So I'm curious, just where do you see generally views of China's provision of technology going in African countries and in countries throughout the rest of the global South, and do you see governments or civil society actors moving to prevent risks to freedom and privacy? Not to mention potential vulnerability to Chinese government leverage, so that China, Africa, or China, Latin America, or any countries in this broad, scope of what we call the global South, can actually benefit, citizens.
Yeah, sure. So if you kind of look into the general distribution of surveillance technologies, and then you look at data protection responses, what you see is about, give or take, 22 countries on the continent have some kind or version of surveillance technology that's been made available by a Chinese private actor. And when you look at kind of data protection measures, about half of the continent has something related to data protection and privacy in the books. That means effectively that half of the continent has not particularly responded to the demand of data protection. And that is in part because some actors either don't see the immediacy of it, or simply they might not necessarily have the domestic capacity in order to realize some of their data protection ambitions. In a specific context that I work on, which is both kind of Kenya and South Africa, there have been recent efforts in kind of bolstering data protection and privacy. But a lot of the local concerns surrounding that is not simply whether or not having the necessary legislative architecture, but also the capacity to actually enforce it. Specifically when the provider of some of the services is an external actor like a Chinese company that is storing the data, not necessarily in the given country. And so it raises a series of questions both about data protection, but also data sovereignty. And then more generally, there are obvious, rolling suspicions about, technologies being installed in order to support alternative political or geopolitical ambitions. There's not much a kind of available empirical evidence that is illustrative of that point, but there is immediate local responses that are developing, specifically in the context that I work in, to speak to this. I think kind of trying to backtrack some of my initial comments, it's important to think through why Chinese companies are also aiming to kind of close these infrastructural gaps and these digital gaps within Africa. A lot of Huawei's activities, which we are looking at now, say in 2018 or 2019, is really a consequence of a long durée of kind of active involvement in the ICT space. I think my colleague early on mentioned that the kind of the go out policy was the initial kind of policy framework that enabled that activity. And Huawei enters Kenya in about 1995, and they've been there ever since. Effectively closing the structural gap to pursue connectivity at all levels, but specifically in the ICT sector. And now you're seeing charges of all sorts about some of their activities, but it's a general consequence of this kind of long activity on the continent that we kind of also have to keep attention and note of.
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful, and especially on this subject of what's happening in the tech space, it's an area where there's a lot of opinions being thrown around, but there's a paucity of actual expertise, I think, on it. So it's helpful to have that context. Maybe I'll turn to you, Veda, and also others who wants to jump in. I know you've done, as you kind of talked about in your opening remarks a little bit, you've done a lot of work on the labor and environmental impact of China's projects and infrastructure projects, especially in Africa. And there is evidence of China's investments in countries, or the promise of investments, leading to some countries watering down or just completely ignoring some elements of their own labor and environmental regulatory policies. So I'm curious, you mentioned civil society, and I'm sure that's a part of it, but what else needs to be done to ensure that China's investments benefit labor rights, benefit or respect environmental protections? And of course, it's not just about China, it's about the local governments and the local officials. How can that kind of be bolstered as countries continue to engage and take on Chinese projects?
Right. No, that's a big question, Dave. I think before I directly answer your question, I'll just give you a little bit of an anecdote. When I was interviewing people in the Zambian copper belt, and maybe Emmanuel, you could add to this too, and we were interviewing people who were representatives from the workers' unions, right? And so they told us this point as well. They said that, it's really difficult working in Chinese mines, all kinds of issues, labor issues, environmental issues, ecological issues. But a lot of the graduates from the mining colleges they would still prefer to work in a Chinese mine first before going off into the market to work in other foreign mines. And I found this interesting, and I asked them why, if they know the conditions are offered, why would they want to? And then they said, oh, it's because you'll work with the best technology, because the technology that they've learned, or the syllabus that they've learned in the vocational training schools or those colleges that they studied in can be outdated, right? So if you go work in a Chinese mine, they train you on all the latest technology, and then you're more market savvy when you actually leave. So, and then in the same interview, we were talking to heads of vocational training institutes, and they were saying that, and then we asked them, how come, what are your sense of the graduates who leave your colleges? And their sense was, the Chinese have figured out that they're going to be here long term. So they are now funding us to get updated machinery. They are sending some of our teachers on scholarships to China to teach them. And then there's, in some cases, and I asked them who paid for the machinery, for instance. Some were on loan, some were given to them. And in a lot of the cases, Chinese faculty were brought in from similar universities in Beijing or some other provinces, and the professors and the teachers in these vocational colleges were given training, right? So and then cut to another case study. We looked at a similar project that was by another European firm, and they had these strict, obviously, ecological, environmental things in place, and they were actually running out of business. And then there was a sense that there was talk, that there was chatter that Chinese companies were looking to buy those mines up, right? So it's this really funny thing, but they've been able to operate on really questionable ecosystems, and yet they are the best option there is in many different ways, right? So the civil society organizations, like I mentioned, become important because they are important to call these things out, which is important, which is step number one, because then they're not ignored and they cannot be brushed under the carpet. Step number two is then who takes responsibility, right? And you have many cases where licenses have been canceled, local governments have stepped in, they've forced these companies to shut down their operations. That's happened a lot. So those examples are there as well. I think even Paul has written about this. So there have been instances where these smaller people in the equation have been able to hold these huge powers to account. The question, I think, is it all comes down to, like everyone says, right? It comes down to the African agency. It comes down to the governments. It comes down to people who've struck these deals. And the only thing to be done, the way I see it, is how can we help sort of plug the gap in what's happening in the grassroots and what's actually talked about at the policy table. Because in theory, sometimes everything's perfect. When you read some of these communiques, everything is in place, right? But when you go to the grassroots, you see maybe sometimes reality doesn't match up to theory. And so I think our role as researchers or people who study this is to sort of highlight the fact that there are discrepancies, but it's up to people who've signed these deals to then see what they want to do.
Yeah, those a great set of points. And I just invite Emmanuel, if you want to jump in on top of that or kind of add on specifically. I know you've done a lot of work on Zambia's relations with China, the impact, as Veda was just talking about Zambian governance and Zambian agency on its financial health and on Zambia's democracy. So, particularly with the recent change in government and the change in tone out of Lusaka toward Beijing, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the key lessons for other countries in Africa and also, across the global South from that experience.
Oh, thank you very much, David. I will just add on what my colleagues have said, just to add something to what before I come to what Veda said, just to add something to what Bulelani said about China trying to fill in some gaps that it has noticed, especially through Huawei technology, and the issue of data will become increasingly important. And as he said, there has been some South Africa and Kenya now mooting some legislation to see how the localization, harvesting, and usage of data could actually be beneficial to Africa and could not be actually adverse to the continent and the privacy of citizens. But then it will be important it will be interesting actually to note what will happen now that Huawei's phones obviously have been using Android as an operating system. Now they introduced Harmony OS last year just to try and circumvent that, to make sure that at least they have all the information that they need to be operated on Huawei phones. So it will be interesting to see how that will pan out in the long run, and how the global South and Africa in particular will react towards that, because there is a deep sense of anxiety about whether or not Huawei is using that technology as a handmaiden to give data to the Chinese state. So it will be interesting to see that. For now, it's just in the realm of speculation, obviously. Coming to what Veda said, yes, Zambia is an important and unique case actually in Africa's relationship with China. And now with the change of government since the 12th of August elections last year, we are seeing something that is very interesting, because in the run-up to the elections last year, the mayor of Lusaka, Miles Sampa, who was actually part of the political party that was kicked out of power last year, carried out these unbidden or unannounced inspections at Chinese-run facilities, and he found that the conditions for workers there were deplorable. Unfortunately, the government at the time, the Patriotic Front at the time, was heavily indebted to China. Up to now, we do not know how much was the quantum of debt that we owed China, although we know that it is more than 33% of our external debt. We are an economy of 25 billion, and we have external debt of about 14 billion. The government kept lying to people that it was 11.97 billion, but now it has been established that that debt is actually more than 14 billion, and a third of that is owed to China. And because of that amount of being that profundity of indebtedness to China, the previous government actually chastised their own mayor by saying, no, you know what, by going to investors' facilities unannounced in the way you did, you will be scaring away investors. And the Zambian youth, especially, and civil society organizations were livid about the government that was kowtowing to China at the expense of its own citizens. And that kind of played itself into how the youth galvanized themselves to ensure that the previous government was kicked out of power. It can be traced back to what happened in 2018. For about 2 years, Zambia did not have an IMF country representative because the Zambian government chased out Alfredo Bodini, who was, I think he was Portuguese, but he was an IMF country representative of Zambia because he warned the Zambian government about unsustainable borrowing, especially from China. Instead of the government taking heed, they told the IMF to withdraw Bodini, and for 2 years we did not have an IMF representative. And at the same time, embarrassingly enough, we were busy pleading for a loan facility from the IMF. So it was all those issues that were playing into the minds of Zambian youth. And obviously, the Patriotic Front government was kicked out of power in August. And surprisingly enough, the first diplomat to meet the newly elected president was a Chinese diplomat. So obviously, he was trying to suss out the new president and see whether or not he will carry out the wishes of the Zambian, which obviously to have a more assertive role towards Zambia's relationship with China. We are yet to see that, obviously, but we have seen that the new government, from what we have seen in the last 8 months, it is a government that is slightly moving towards the ethos of democracy, and that plays out negatively towards China, of course. But then we are yet to see how that is going to play out. So the picture is kind of mixed in Zambia. China is it's almost intrinsic to Zambia's economic survival. But at the same time, the Chinese know very well that Zambians cannot be relied upon to be just supine in their interactions with China, because we have a thriving democracy, we have a vigilant youth, and we have an active trade union organization or trade union movement as well that will keep the government in check to make sure that some of the things that we are seeing China do on the rest of the continent cannot be replicated in Zambia.
I think that the lessons from Zambia are really very important to pay attention to, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. And I think this recent change in government, leads me to another question, which is a lot of, regimes, governments that have been very close to China, arguably have had some corrupt relationships, and that have concluded lopsided deals with China that were detrimental to countries' finances and perhaps to their independence, have been removed through elections, despite sometimes those regimes' best efforts to rig them. And I'm not specifically talking about Zambia. I'm thinking of there's other places in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also Latin America. So, how important do you see free and fair electoral processes to keeping leaders honest and ensuring that they engage with China in ways that benefit their citizens rather than just their own, political fortunes or their bank accounts? I think sometimes we forget about the importance of just elections, in addition to, of course, independent media and civil society. So just curious as to anyone's thoughts on that.
Do I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead. Emmanuel, you, okay. Will, anyone? Sorry.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me be specific and talk about Zambia again. I'm actually excited about Veda's research. I'm from Zambia originally, so naturally I'm kind of inclined to your research. I'll talk about Zambia and what has happened, especially in the last 30 years. For a sub-Saharan African country, I think we have done quite well in entrenching the tenets of democracy. We have had about 7 presidents. We have had about 3 regime changes. We have had political parties removed from power. So that is quite a distinction that we share in Zambia. And the people know, the people in government know actually that they cannot count on unqualified support, so to say, because people want dividends that come with democracy. Elections on their own are just a perfunctory exercise. They're box-ticking exercises, as some people would say, but credible elections, especially elections that see oppressive governments driven out of power, then those are the quality of elections that we want. So it's about quality as well, not just quantity and regularity in terms of elections. What has happened in Zambia? Before I come to what happened in Zambia, an interesting fact actually in Africa is that the more countries hold elections, regular elections, the more they actually shift towards China. We saw the case with Malawi, for example. That is why we have to be careful, because when we talk about elections and their importance, because what happens is that governments that rely on the support of people to be in power are more inclined towards a relationship with China that they think is beneficial, even if it's myopically beneficial, because China comes with investments. Well, one of the strengths actually about China is that it deals in loans. It deals with low interest loans rather than donations. I think that should be understood very well. But then the problem with these loans that come from China is that because of the non-interference policy, China does not really care how sustainable that debt is and how much of a burden it could be on struggling African countries. So let me put that aside and now come back to the point I was about to make. What we have seen in Zambia is a situation whereby the government knows that democracy has been entrenched in the country, but then the government has to heed the voice of the citizens, especially those who are very vigilant. Civil society organizations, we have what we call the Oasis Forum in Zambia, which has been very pivotal in the past in trying to curtail even presidents that wanted to breach the 2-term limit, for example, to stand for the 3rd election. Those are institutions that have been very vigilant in monitoring Zambia's relationship with China. Unfortunately, since 2001 to 2008, we had a politician who became president in 2011 called Michael Chiufya. Now, he is the one who brought the discourse on China's relationship with Zambia to the front of Zambia's political discourse. Unfortunately, though, much of his rhetoric was cloaked in racism, and people talked about it as though it was agency. And that is that is a totally different thing. Even the names that he gave to Chinese nationals in Zambia, the pejorative terms he gave for Chinese products in Zambia, all that was not agency at all. It was actually racialism. But then, thankfully, now we have seen that independent young Zambians and civil society organizations, because of this deepening interaction between Chinese nationals who come to Zambia at their own behest, not at the behest of the Chinese government, there is now a change in terms of the perception of China, because it is an independent perception. It's not an institutional perception by ambitious opposition politicians or politicians who are actually in power. But Zambians, ordinary Zambians such as myself, who interact with ordinary Chinese at that subnational level, are forming their own opinion, an opinion that is not only shaped by political players. So that is of utmost importance. And as Professor Howard French talks about in his, it says in his book, China's Second Continent, he says the most important factor actually in shaping Africa's relationship with China is not an agenda that is set by the politicians in Beijing. It is actually the incoming of the interaction of independent Chinese. Most of them who come to Africa at the termination of their contracts, they choose not to go back to China, then they ply their trade in Africa. Those are people who are shaping Africa's interaction with China to a considerable degree. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel. There's so much to dig into there. I'll just point a couple of things. I think the point about avoiding racism in terms of what we talk about when we talk about resilience to Chinese government-linked influence is really important. It's important in the United States and it's important everywhere. And I think that that's something always to be vigilant against. And then I think your point about elections and how obviously it's quality over quantity, especially, given the fact, Samantha Custer from A-Data in our first panel was talking about the interesting findings that she's had in terms of China targeting influence just to very, discrete areas, and also, in terms of timing. And I've certainly seen ahead of elections, Chinese investment timed to benefit friendly politicians in places like Serbia or the Maldives and elsewhere. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work, but you can certainly have elections that they only reinforce some of the negatives that can come from engagement with China as opposed to having beneficial outcomes. So I think that's a really important point. Beta or Bulelani? Bulelani, go ahead. Looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can speak to two points that Emmanuel raised, specifically at the level of thinking about elections as a rudimentary litmus test for the health of a society. And then I can also kind of speak to this point about China's willingness to work with all kinds of political arrangements on the continent. To the kind of the first point, elections themselves are obviously important, but as it was noted, it's always about the quality of the democratical enterprise, specifically the level of the rule of law and what kind of institutional mechanisms are in place in order to preserve some kind of arrangement of civil liberties. And specifically in my work, I think a lot about the kinds of data protection measures that are being put in place on the African continent, both to effectively ensure sustainable developmental projects while simultaneously also ensuring that there's a kind of human-centered approach to tech investments. And then on the other part that is quite paramount is thinking about China's willingness to work with all kinds of political arrangements. What is quite interesting about China is that it doesn't have a kind of political preference for a robust, healthy democracy or an authoritarian state. And it is kind of this willingness to work with all kinds of political arrangements that then raises questions about how we should be interpolating China's diplomatic strategy on the continent, but also how this kind of diverse kinds of engagements offer legitimacy to China as a country preoccupied with political equality on the continent. And it is this kind of attention to sovereignty that I think that sometimes we then lose track of the spillover consequences of China's activities on the continent, which sometimes can be bad, specifically when we're not thinking actively about the spillover consequences of data protection measures.
Yeah, Beta, did you want to add anything on this? Or?
Yeah, Bulelani, are you done though?
Yeah, I was gonna go on, but
no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
Oh no, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. Yeah, I was just gonna add, a final point specifically in thinking more actively about, what does a healthy data protection measure look like on the continent that is both not only preoccupied with, effectively exporting a model from Europe or the US, but really is kind of contingent on thinking about localized preferences for how this arrangement will be organized.
Okay, now I shall step in. Again, I just wanted to sort of bring in a very specific context. We were looking through data that we had from several investment agencies. And when we were looking at some of the big ticket projects, right? And we were looking at we were just doing our own, analysis of how much revenue this would, how long it would take for them to break even and things like that. And somehow the numbers didn't add up. Right. So we spoke to some of the local economists and we asked them, but why this particular geography? Like, why this province? Like, are we missing something? Are we not seeing this? And then they said, oh, that's because that's the president's or the head of state's province, right? And they signed this deal just before elections or something like that, right? And then if that head of state then left, that the project would sort of not break even, right? So then we asked them, and then this became a question that we asked a lot of the scholars we were interviewing in different universities. And a lot of them sort of came back with, maybe there should be some kind of an office or some kind of a power center that has a long-term strategic vision when you take on this amounts of debt. That it cannot just be the president's office that says, oh, okay, let's sanction this now. There has to be more checks and balances to that. But then, of course, more questions on what would that look like, who would have that kind of power, et cetera, sort of went into, the abstracts. But I think that's just something that I wanted to throw out. And I was wondering, maybe Emmanuel wants to add to that.
No, I think I'm okay with that. Thank you very much, Veda.
I think, but Beta, that's a very important point, and it's something you see, this kind of notion of projects and investments being targeted at, the president's local province or examples of that. You see that in lots of places. You see that saw that in Sri Lanka. Everyone talks about the Hambantota port project as kind of like this poster child for the supposed debt trap narrative, which, as we've discussed many times today, has been largely debunked, but it also, is a place where a port that didn't have arguably a lot of economic sense behind it when it went forward happened arguably because, the local government at the time under the leadership of President Rajapaksa wanted to put it in some place that was convenient to his own political fortunes or to his, his own constituencies. So this is something that we've seen in other places. I wanted to ask before I cut you off, Bulani, I actually wanted to ask a question on specifically the topic that you were talking about based upon an audience question, which is, what kinds of things are African countries doing to ensure that their data is not being exploited by China or by other countries? Do you see some good examples of that already happening? And as you said, it had to be kind of localized and focused on specific conditions.
Oh, yeah, sure. And also, I'll just add, this is definitely, I think, a place in which, U.S. partners can necessarily support in thinking more actively about what does it mean to necessarily support localized activities in building better and more robust data protection measures. So there are activities across the continent and a lot of kind of both, especially the civil society space that are thinking more actively about what data protection would look like, both in the countries that I work on, both in South Africa and in Kenya, but specifically in the Kenya example, there's a data protection measure that literally just came out a year ago that was mostly preoccupied both with thinking about how to both store, manage, and process biometrical data. This particular policy was in response to a series of other kind of data protection measures that were kind of published by the state in 2018. What this one in particular does empowers a commissioner to effectively take the responsibility of managing the data, but also on clamping down on the misuse of data by private actors. However, one gap in this new measure is that it mostly prioritizes actors that are processing and storing data who are locally registered, which means it doesn't necessarily hold for actors who are engaged in Kenya, but are not necessarily registered in Kenya. But also this particular office is mostly within the state. So it's under the ICT ministry, which obviously raises questions about what if the state abused that data in itself for its own kind of personal interest. To me, it seems quite obvious that one kind of step and measure that is necessary is also to think about the independence of this office as relates to the government. And so, there are multiple examples of this sort, but, it will be very much heavily reliant on thinking more actively from the ground up.
Unless anyone else wanted to jump in on that, I want to change gears just a little bit. Each of you focuses primarily on China's relationships in Africa, where, of course, many countries have substantial relationships going back decades. I'm curious, other regions of the Global South, I'm thinking specifically of Latin America, are relatively newer to the sort of engagement and influence that China has had in African countries like Zambia or Tanzania or others. So, given that, and given that we're talking about resilience, if you were, advising Latin American governments or democratic actors and others, what would you advise, at this point when it's kind of an earlier stage in engagement with China to help prevent some of the problems that have popped up in Africa, to kind of head them off at the pass so that these countries in say, the Western Hemisphere can benefit from engagement with China and not go through some of these troubles that African countries have gone through?
Yes, I'm happy to start on that question. Yes, it is really an important question. And as you rightly put it, Africa is more like a pioneer in the Global South relationship with China. And then in Africa, I would look at countries such as Tanzania and Zambia being pioneers in the African context, so to say. First of all, the most important thing to note is that China has actually been used as an excuse to avoid Western censure, especially. Sudan and Zimbabwe make the perfect examples of that. When they moved towards China's orbit, they did not do so because they saw something that was very laudable about China's presence in Africa. They just went to China because they couldn't cope with Western sanctions, especially. If you ask an ordinary African, Afrobarometer is an organization that carries out perceptions on international players. And if you ask an African ordinarily, just on the surface, what do you think? What do you think of? Is China a positive or a negative force on Africa? They'll say 60% of people actually, according to the latest data, more than 60% actually would say, well, China is actually a force for good. But if you dig deeper about that, they actually mean China is a force for good because Africa has failed to provide gainful employment for its people. So people think as if labor, casualized labor, by the way, not even formal labor, not skilled labor, casualized labor is actually better than destitution. And that casualized labor is usually done under the aegis of China. But then if you look substantially in terms of politics, in terms of political sanity, a lot of Africans are actually amenable to the idea of a democratic Africa. So that is what other regions could learn. It is not sustainable to just be enamored with China myopically so because you're dodging Western criticism or Western condemnation. That's the first thing. The second thing is that China is very good with optics. That's why even a minor thing, even here at the University of Johannesburg, a minor thing, they will always insist, let us have a photo session. At the end, they'll have a photo session. They'll probably publish something out there and they say, well, we went to the University of Johannesburg and Emmanuel Matambo greeted us very well and stuff like that, implying that I am very, very welcoming towards the Chinese, and quite finely so. So that is another thing that even people in the other regions should be very careful. What we see our governments doing is not actually the case that is happening behind the scenes. Another thing is that because of indebtedness, political organizations should always be held to account. In Zambia, for example, the previous political party chased the Cuban ambassador to Zambia because he attended the the establishment of a socialist party in Zimbabwe, which was an opposition political party. But the Chinese, a Chinese diplomat attended the convention of the ruling party. So there are all these double standards that people should pay particular attention to. Now what is coming up is the issue of media as well. Through China Global Television Network here in Africa, now they have their headquarters, the Africa headquarters in China. So that is another reason that needs to be delved into by those other regions, especially though the people who could be counted upon the most are civil society organizations, non-state actors, not state actors who are already beholden to China. So those are just some of the issues to keep in mind as these regions increasingly interact with China.
I guess I can kind of follow up on some really important points that Emmanuel raised, specifically at the level of kind of Chinese rhetoric and media. What is particularly quite striking when you kind of both pay attention to Chinese coverage of the activities on the African continent is their almost insistence on kind of political equality or the salience of sovereignty, which to me, in my work, what I try and establish is how, we're talking about political equality, so that way we don't have to talk about economic inequality, or at least the asymmetrical relations that also structure the conditions of activities between Africa and China. And how specific local actors, are also preoccupied with using this kind of rhetorical device, so that way they are not immediately held accountable, or to think more actively about why they're choosing to, engage with China, which, Emmanuel correctly pointed out, is sometimes as a way, so that way they're not held, into account of the sanctions that were, levied against them by Western actors. And so, when we're thinking more actively about China, we should also be thinking more actively about some of the kind of structural conditions that produce the activities that are unfolding on the ground, especially at the level of kind of asymmetries between the parties that are being involved and engaged.
Ada, go ahead.
I think I'd have three big points. The first one would be, so one of the studies that we had done, we had looked at an infrastructure project in a particular country, which was funded by China XM, which was carried out by Chinese contractors, subcontracted to other Chinese entities. And we looked at another project, similar scale, but funded by the World Bank, carried out by Chinese contractors and subcontracted to Chinese entities, right? And it was very interesting for us to see the differences. So one of the biggest, there's so much about it, but one of the big takeaways was that, things like environmental impact assessments, labor conditions, there were a lot of things that were present in the World Bank project that wasn't in the China XM project, right? And when we talked to the contractors about this, they said, they demanded these things. And to the point of saying that these are actually adding cost overheads, right? This actually makes things expensive, but they demanded it and we delivered, right? So one thing would be if that's where the whole question of the agency and things come in, right? And the second sub point to that is also definitions. I find it very, very interesting that often the Chinese define even very simple things, how the rest of the world defines it is very different from how the Chinese define it. So for instance, the question of tech transfer, we would interview engineers where they would say things like, well, yes, they are transferring technology to us, but all of the plans are in Mandarin. They speak to us in Mandarin, right? They tell us, look at what we're doing and follow, right? And then I ask them, okay, so tomorrow the Chinese engineers go, can you do that? And they say, no, absolutely not, right? But then when we speak to the officials in that country and say, do you think there are gaps in tech transfer? They say, no. We've prioritized tech transfer. Tech transfer is going to be an important part. But then we realize it's just a difference in definition, right? Or approaches, for instance. So that would be one. The second would be the point about negotiation, because this just came up all the time, right? Like I remember we were talking to someone at the Bagamoyo negotiations, and he said, it was only after a few meetings in that they actually brought in a Mandarin speaker on their side, right? And things like that. And then they actually reached out to Singaporean or other lawyers to come help them figure this out, because as one of the officials told me, they keep changing the goalpost, right? So when you don't have that capacity, I think you need to go walk into that room with as much capacity as possible. So that would be one, like play hardball, play hard, because I think they're going to. The third piece of advice would be about state capacity and about strengthening state institutions, because end of the day, I think it all comes down to that. And like one of the, the economist James Sheikpati once told me, debt itself is not bad, right? Debt is needed for growth, but the mismanagement of debt is a problem. Yeah, so those would be my.
Those are very useful, and I hope for those in our audience who are kind of in the civil society space and also just thinking through how to build resilience, I think that's just kind of very nicely encapsulated some of the main lessons to take away from this conversation. We have just a few minutes left. I think the last question I would ask, our panelists in a kind of closing sense is, we've talked a lot today through our panels about what role the United States, Europe, the global north, if you want to call it that, can play in actually, kind of facilitating and helping in the global south and kind of building resilience. We've heard some skepticism about Build Back Better World and Global Gateway. We've heard a lot, certainly about the importance of not making this about, a U.S.-China geopolitical competition or appearing patronizing or not recognizing the agency of countries. So what, if anything, do you think, really should be the most useful role for developed democracies in trying to bolster the resilience of countries across the global south and making sure that they get, as you were just saying, Veda, the absolute best and most sustainable kind of deal that they can from their engagement with China? Maybe, Emmanuel, I'll start with you, and then each of you maybe just take 30 seconds and try to answer that in a short time.
Thank you very much. I'll share my PowerPoint presentation with James, and then he can distribute it to anyone who is interested, in order for an in-depth understanding of what I talked about. The first thing is, of course, people-to-people relations, the strengthening of non-state actors, especially from the West. China has been very good, for example, with scholarships. If that as well could be bolstered by the West, most especially because it is a growing trend. Another one, obviously, is the strengthening of civil society organizations and the media, independent media, especially in Africa. That is another thing. Another thing that the West could do as well is to tone down the way the West counsels Africa against China. It is more like a zero-sum game, and it appears to be patronizing. Rex Tillerson did that in 2018, I think. Hillary Clinton did that in Zambia as well. There is this attitude of thinking as though Zambia is Africa is a passerby in this Africa-China relationship, which is not entirely the case. So sometimes it is not about how you promote democracy. It is not about promoting democracy itself, but how you promote democracy. Yes, we are. Africans could be skeptical about human rights. They could be skeptical about the issue of democracy, but they are not skeptical about accountability. And the West could actually do well to make sure that it capitalizes on that innate need for accountability in African governance, especially from the non-state actor. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bulala, any final words?
Yeah, sure. Always try and meet people where they are, and specifically thinking about some of the challenges that the African continent face. I obviously spend most of my day thinking about how to build more robust data protection measures on the continent, specifically in Kenya and in South Africa. And to me, it seems quite obvious to think about, well, what do these local audiences mean and think about data protection? And then how do you effectively promote the values that are behind these initiatives, while simultaneously not aiming to further utilize this, salient initiative as a talking point against China. The general predilection towards to kind of framing it between a US and China relationship further obfuscates the salience of the initiative, while also simultaneously also losing sight of African agency in determining these outcomes. And so in, really engaging actors where they are, and specifically with their priorities as the kind of centripetal means of pursuit is the best way to kind of go forward.
Great, thank you. And Veda, last 20 seconds to you.
3 points. one, focus on individual and institutional capacity building. I think that's going to be the core of it. The second would be, like I said before, shift the conversation from aid to investments and all that comes with it. And third, like the both of them mentioned, I think it's about crafting a narrative, checking your tone, prioritizing the needs of, actually having conversations with these African or Latin American or these host governments. And I think talking about or crafting these relationships as just bilaterals, not as a consequence of a larger geopolitical game. I think because that's just disrespectful and completely patronizing.
Great, thank you. We are out of time. I think this has been a great conversation. Thank you to the panelists for all your insightful comments and recommendations for building resilience across the Global South. So now I'd like to conclude and pass back to Dr. Joshua Eisenman to close out today's conference.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks, Dave. This has been a fantastic conference. I've really learned a lot from everyone. And, I think that the point that Veda just made is an important one to end on, right? That countries are not part of a kind of geopolitical chess game, that they need to be engaged where they are and on the issues that they care about. I think that's a really essential point. So I'm glad she ended on it. Emmanuel, in listening to his comments, I'm reminded the important difference that, placing a port in your own home province so you can win an election, or working hand in glove with Beijing to rewrite laws to avoid oversight, as we heard earlier, occurred in Venezuela. That's not Global South agency or African agency. It's actually China exploiting corruption, greed, and weak governance, right? And it's important to know that, because I think we sometimes might slip into this idea that small countries can just build capacity, that they should just bootstrap it, that they should just do a better job. But I think that kind of overlooks the fact that China has been identifying weaknesses in smaller nations for thousands of years and exploiting them. That's to some degree the history of China's relations throughout imperial dynasties, using the Middle Kingdom mentality that Iman talked about earlier. So it's systemic. That's the point. And ultimately, in order to cope with it, it requires more than simply saying, do a better job, but to create cross-national as well as domestic communication, collaboration, and mutual support mechanisms where best practices can be shared. And that to the extent that those things can be shared, that they can help to improve and actually create a much more robust and equal agency among actors in the Global South, such that we're not dependent on the goodwill of certain people in certain positions of power. But we create a systemic response to the systemic asymmetry that we deal with. So just a few last thoughts there. And, also to mention that this is just the first in a series of engagements that we're going to be working on through this wonderful new initiative that Dave and I are going to be leading through with the Notre Dame Pulte Institute for Development at the Keough School of Global Affairs, and with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. And in the coming months, we're going to be coming out with a lot more publications, including a policy report on China in the African media and propaganda spaces. So dealing with just these issues that we've been talking about today, as well as a book I'm actually working on China's political and security relations in Africa, and the role of the International Department of the Communist Party of China. So we're going to be going beyond a lot of typical issues and into the the economic and the security, as well as the political relations, which are so important. So stay tuned for our future events, which we're going to be pushing out there, as well as publications like the ones I mentioned. And in closing today, I would just like to thank all of our distinguished speakers for giving us all of these great ideas to consider and to keep this issue, even as we're watching the ongoing terrible invasion in the Ukraine. We can also, we shouldn't forget that China's engagement in the Global South is ongoing, and it's certainly we really need to be paying attention to. In the future, we're excited and to move off the Zoom platform, to move back to face-to-face engagement. Of course, we've exploited the Zoom platform about as much as we could here today, having people coming as far from Cairo and certainly Europe and a subcontinent. So we've had people from all over the world. That being said, we look forward to meeting you all in person once COVID conditions are again permitting. And we encourage you to visit the websites of the Pulte Institute for Development and the Global China Hub at Atlantic Council. And so with that, I'm going to thank you all for attending and bid you all adieu, and enjoy the rest of your week and your weekend.